the world we live in feels mapped, measured, and understood. Every ocean charted, every land explored, every mystery supposedly solved. But what if that isn't true? What if some of the greatest secrets in human history were never meant to be discovered? Not because they were hidden, but because they were erased. Across time, entire events have vanished. Armies that disappeared without a trace. Objects that shouldn't exist. Knowledge that appears and then is gone, as if history itself chose to forget. And perhaps the most unsettling part is this. The deeper we search, the more we realize we may not be looking at missing pieces of history. We may be looking at something that was deliberately removed. For centuries, historians, archaeologists, and explorers have tried to solve these puzzles. Yet every answer only leads to more questions, because sometimes the truth doesn't just hide, it resists being found. Tonight, we begin with one of the most haunting disappearances ever recorded. A force so powerful, so disciplined, that its sudden vanishing should have shaken an empire. And yet, it left behind almost nothing. No bodies, no final records, no clear ending, only silence. The Lost Legion, in the far northern reaches of ancient Britain, where the land turns wild and the sky feels heavier, there exists a story that refuses to settle into history. It is not just a mystery. It is an absence, a gap where thousands of men, trained soldiers of one of the greatest empires in history, simply cease to exist. This is the story of the Ninth Legion, a unit of the Roman army so formidable, so respected, that its name alone carried weight across continents. These were not inexperienced recruits, they were battle-hardened soldiers, veterans of brutal campaigns, men who had marched across deserts, forests, and mountains under the banner of Rome. And yet, sometime in the early 2nd century, they vanished. Not retreated, not defeated in a recorded battle, not reassigned. Vanished. To understand the scale of this mystery, we have to step into the world they lived in. At the height of its power, the Roman Empire stretched across vast territories, connecting cultures, languages, and landscapes under one rule. Britain, however, was different. It was distant, cold, unpredictable, and most importantly, it resisted control. The northern regions of Britain, especially beyond what we now call Hadrian's Wall, were home to tribes the Romans struggled to dominate. These lands were dense with forests, broken by hills, and often covered in mist that made visibility difficult even during the day. It was into this environment that the Ninth Legion marched, a mission, as far as we can tell, to secure control, to push further north, to establish Roman authority in lands that had never truly accepted it. And then, nothing. The records stop. No detailed account of a final battle, no official Roman documentation explaining their fate, no clear evidence of where they went. For an empire that documented almost everything, this silence is deeply unusual. Because Rome did not forget its legions, especially not one like this. Naturally, the first explanation seems obvious. They were destroyed. Perhaps the legion marched into hostile territory and was ambushed, surrounded by local tribes familiar with the terrain, cut off from reinforcements, slowly overwhelmed. It's a compelling theory, one that fits the dangers of the region. But there's a problem. If such a catastrophic defeat had occurred, the complete destruction of an entire Roman legion, it would have been recorded, not hidden. Rome often documented its defeats, sometimes even turning them into warnings or lessons. So why not this one? Why is there no detailed account of such a massive loss? This is where the mystery deepens. Some historians have suggested a quieter explanation. What if the Ninth Legion was never destroyed at all? What if it was simply relocated? There are fragments of evidence suggesting that the legion may have been transferred to another part of the empire, possibly to the eastern provinces where conflicts were ongoing. If that were the case, then the disappearance isn't a mystery, just a gap in records. But this theory also raises questions. If the legion continued elsewhere, where are the inscriptions, the military records, the usual traces that Roman legions left behind wherever they went? Because Roman legions didn't just move, they left marks, names carved into stone, evidence in settlements, records in military logs. And yet, for the Ninth Legion, those marks are strangely absent. It's as if they didn't continue, but also weren't entirely destroyed. And that contradiction is what makes this story so unsettling. Then there are the more extreme possibilities, the ones that step beyond traditional history. Some have suggested that the Legion may have been sent on a mission that was never meant to be recorded. A classified operation, in a sense, though not in the modern meaning of the word. A task so sensitive, so unusual, that its outcome was deliberately erased. But erased by whom? And for what reason? Others take a different approach. They point not to human conflict, but to the land itself. The north of Britain was not just dangerous because of its people. It was dangerous because of its environment. Unforgiving weather, endless rain, freezing temperatures, difficult terrain. A large group of soldiers cut off from supply lines could slowly weaken. Food shortages, disease, exposure, not a sudden destruction, but a gradual disappearance. A fading. But even this explanation struggles to answer one key question: where are the remains? Thousands of soldiers do not simply vanish without leaving behind weapons, armor, or burial sites. Archaeology has uncovered many Roman artifacts across Britain, but nothing that clearly points to the complete loss of an entire legion, and that absence speaks loudly. Because in history, silence is rarely empty. It usually means something is missing. Over time, the story of the Ninth Legion has grown beyond history and into legend. Writers, historians, and storytellers have tried to fill the gap with their own interpretations. Some imagine a final, desperate battle in the mist. Others suggest betrayal. Some even hint at something far stranger, something that cannot be explained through conventional means. And while many of these ideas remain speculative, they all stem from the same undeniable fact: we do not know what happened. And perhaps more importantly, we are not even sure where to look, because the disappearance of the Ninth Legion is not just about a missing army. It is about the limits of history itself, how something so large, so significant, can slip through the cracks of time, how records can end, how evidence can vanish, how certainty can dissolve into questions. And maybe the most unsettling thought is this: if an entire Roman legion can disappear without a clear trace, what else has been lost? What other events, just as significant, have quietly faded into silence? As we stand on the edge of this mystery, looking back across nearly 2,000 years, one thing becomes clear. The past is not as complete as we think. It is fragmented, incomplete, full of gaps that we try to fill with logic and theory, but sometimes those gaps remain, unanswered, unresolved, waiting. And the Ninth Legion remains one of them, the machine that should not exist. There are moments in history when something is discovered that doesn't just raise questions, it breaks the timeline. It forces us to confront a possibility that is deeply uncomfortable, that ancient civilizations may have known far more than we are willing to accept, and sometimes what they knew seems impossible. In 1901, off the coast of a small Greek island, a group of sponge divers made a discovery that, at first, seemed unremarkable. They had come across the remains of an ancient shipwreck, resting quietly beneath the Mediterranean waters. Scattered across the ocean floor were statues, pottery, and fragments of what looked like ordinary cargo from a Roman-era vessel. But buried among these objects was something else. Something strange. Something that didn't belong. At first, it appeared to be nothing more than a collection of corroded bronze fragments, broken pieces fused together by centuries underwater. Easily overlooked. But when these fragments were brought to the surface and examined more closely, everything changed, because hidden inside that corroded mass was a machine. Not a simple tool, not a decorative object, a machine with gears, interlocking, precise, carefully engineered gears, and not just a few, dozens. What the divers had unknowingly recovered would later be called the Antikythera mechanism, and to this day, it remains one of the most baffling artifacts ever discovered. Because it should not exist. Dating back over 2,000 years, this device predates the kind of mechanical complexity it represents by more than a millennium. To put it simply, Technology like this was not supposed to exist in the ancient world, and yet, there it was. Silent, corroded, real. As researchers began to study the fragments, they realized that this was not a random collection of parts. It was a carefully constructed system, a device designed for a purpose. But what purpose could possibly require this level of precision in an era we often think of as primitive? The answer only deepened the mystery, because the Antikythera mechanism appears to have been an ancient analog computer, a machine capable of predicting astronomical events, tracking the movements of the sun, the moon, possibly even the planets. It could calculate eclipses, map cycles of celestial bodies, measure time in ways that required an astonishing understanding of mathematics and engineering. All of this built around 100 BC. Think about that for a moment. At a time when most tools were simple, when mechanical innovation was still in its early stages, someone, somewhere, had created a device so advanced that even modern scientists struggled to fully understand it when it was first discovered. How? That is the question that has haunted this artifact ever since, because the existence of the mechanism suggests something extraordinary. It suggests that the ancient world may have possessed knowledge that was later lost, not gradually forgotten, but completely erased. The more scientists examined the device using modern imaging technologies, the more intricate it appeared. Tiny gear teeth, precise ratios, complex arrangements that required not just craftsmanship, but deep theoretical knowledge. This was not an experiment. This was not a prototype. This was the result of a fully developed understanding of mechanical engineering. And yet, there is nothing else like it. No other machines of similar complexity from that time have ever been found. No clear lineage of development. No earlier versions leading up to it. No later versions improving upon it. It appears suddenly, fully formed, and then disappears, which leads to an unsettling possibility. What if this was not the beginning of something, but the end of something, a final remnant of a technological tradition that was lost, a glimpse into a level of knowledge that once existed and then vanished? Some historians argue that the Greeks were capable of remarkable innovation. After all, they developed advanced mathematics, philosophy, and early forms of engineering. But even within that context, the Antikythera mechanism stands apart. It is too precise, too complex, too ahead of its time. So where did the knowledge come from? One theory suggests that this device was part of a broader, now lost tradition of mechanical technology, that there may have been workshops, inventors, and scholars who developed similar machines, but whose work did not survive the collapse of ancient civilizations. If that is true, then what we are looking at is not an anomaly, but a fragment, a surviving piece of something much larger. But if that's the case, then another question emerges. Why did it disappear? Why did this level of knowledge not continue? Why did humanity, after achieving such complexity, seem to take a step backward? History is often seen as a steady progression, a movement forward, but the Antikythera mechanism challenges that idea. It suggests that progress is not always linear, that knowledge can be lost. Entire fields of understanding can vanish, leaving behind only isolated clues. And this device may be one of those clues. Of course, there are more speculative theories, ideas that push beyond conventional explanations. Some suggest that the mechanism may have been influenced by an even older civilization, one whose knowledge predates the Greeks, a civilization that developed advanced technology and then disappeared, leaving only fragments behind. Others take this even further, proposing that the knowledge required to build such a device could not have originated entirely within the ancient world as we understand it, that it may point to something external, something unknown. But these theories, while intriguing, remain unproven. What we are left with is the object itself, a machine that exists, a machine that works, a machine that should not be possible given the timeline we believe in. And perhaps that is what makes it so powerful. It doesn't rely on speculation. It is real. You can see it, study it, analyze it, and yet it refuses to fully explain itself. Even today, researchers continue to uncover new details about how the mechanism functioned. Hidden inscriptions, subtle design features, clues that suggest it may have been even more sophisticated than we initially thought. Some believe it could track additional cycles we haven't fully decoded. Others suggest it may have had functions beyond astronomy, possibly connected to calendars, cultural events, or even navigation. But every discovery leads to the same conclusion. We still don't fully understand it, and that raises a final unsettling question. If the ancient world was capable of creating something like this, what else did they know? What other technologies existed that have not survived? What ideas were lost, not because they were impossible, but because they were forgotten? It's easy to think of history as something fixed, something we understand, but artifacts like the Antikythera mechanism remind us that history is incomplete, that there are gaps, moments where knowledge appears and then disappears without explanation. And in those gaps, there is uncertainty. Because if humanity once reached this level of understanding and lost it, then what we know today may not be the peak of progress. It may simply be what survived. As we look back at this ancient machine, recovered from the depths of the sea, one thing becomes clear. It is not just a device. It is a question about knowledge, about time, about what we think we know, and more importantly, what we don't. Because somewhere, over 2,000 years ago, someone built this, someone understood it, someone used it, and then their knowledge vanished, leaving behind only fragments that whisper a possibility we are still trying to grasp, that the past may have been far more advanced than we ever imagined, and that what we call history may only be part of the story, the objects with no purpose. There are artifacts in history that we understand almost immediately. A sword is a weapon, a coin is currency, a tool serves a function. Even when time erodes their details, their purpose remains clear. But then, there are objects that refuse to explain themselves. Objects that exist but do not belong. They are real. They can be held, measured, studied. And yet, the question remains, why were they made? Across Europe, scattered through fields, buried beneath soil, and uncovered by chance, archaeologists have discovered a series of objects that seem to challenge logic itself. They are small, geometric, perfectly crafted, and completely unexplained. These are known as the Roman dodecahedrons. At first glance, they appear almost decorative. A hollow object, usually made of bronze, shaped into a geometric form with 12 flat faces. Each face is a perfect pentagon. At each corner, a small knob protrudes, giving the object a strange, almost ornamental appearance. But what makes them truly puzzling are the holes. Each face contains a circular hole, carefully cut, varying in size from one face to another. Some are small, others larger, all precisely shaped. And no two dodecahedrons are exactly the same. They vary in size, in proportion, in detail. But they all follow the same basic design, which suggests something important. They were not random creations, they were intentional. And yet, we have no idea why. More than 100 of these objects have been discovered, spread across regions that were once part of the Roman Empire, from Britain to France, Germany, and beyond. And despite this wide distribution, there is not a single written record explaining their purpose. No mention in Roman texts, no diagrams, no instructions, nothing. This is what makes them so unusual. The Romans were meticulous record keepers. They documented their engineering, their architecture, their military strategies, even their daily lives. And yet for these objects, silence. Which raises an unsettling possibility. Were these objects so common that they didn't need explanation? Or were they part of something not meant to be recorded? At first, historians attempted to apply logic. Perhaps these were tools, instruments used for measurement. The holes, after all, vary in size. Could they have been used to calculate distances, to measure angles, to assist in surveying land? It's a reasonable idea. But when tested, it falls apart. No consistent measurement system has been found. No alignment with known Roman engineering techniques. No evidence that these objects were used in construction or mapping. If they were tools, they were unlike any others we know. So the theory shifted. Maybe they were related to warfare, devices used by soldiers. But again, no evidence. They are too delicate for combat, too varied for standard military equipment, and none have been found in clear battlefield contexts. So if not tools and not weapons, what are they? This is where the theories begin to diverge. Some suggest a connection to astronomy. The geometric shape, the symmetry, the precision, all hint at an understanding of mathematics and structure. Could they have been used to observe the sky, to align with stars, to mark celestial events? It's an intriguing idea. But again, there is no direct proof. Others believe they may have been linked to religion, ritual objects, used in ceremonies. The Romans, like many ancient cultures, had complex spiritual practices. Symbols, shapes, and objects often held deeper meaning. The dodecahedron, with its 12 faces, could represent cosmic order, balance, the structure of the universe. Perhaps these objects were used in sacred rites. But if that were the case, why is there no mention of them in religious texts? No carvings, no depictions, no references in temples or shrines. It is as if they existed just outside the visible structure of Roman society, and that absence is difficult to ignore. Then there is another theory, one that feels almost too simple. Some believe these objects were used for knitting. Yes, knitting. The idea is that the holes could have been used to create gloves or textiles, a practical tool for shaping fabric. It sounds plausible at first, but the complexity of the objects, their craftsmanship, the materials used, all seem excessive for such a mundane purpose. Would something so carefully designed be used for something so ordinary? And if so, why has no clear evidence of this method survived? No instructional remains, no cultural references, just the objects themselves, still unexplained. And then, as with many mysteries, the theories begin to stretch. Some suggest these objects were part of a coded system, a way of communicating information, a physical cipher. The varying hole sizes, the geometric arrangement, could they represent data? Signals? Hidden meaning? It's a fascinating idea. But without a key, it remains speculation. Others go even further, suggesting that these objects may not belong to any known function at all, that their purpose is something we cannot understand because we are asking the wrong questions. What if these were not tools or symbols or instruments? What if they were something else entirely, something that doesn't fit into our categories of logic? This is where the mystery begins to shift, because the more we try to define these objects, the more they resist definition. They exist, they are real, they were made by skilled hands, and yet their purpose remains invisible. Which leads to a deeper question, not just about the objects, but about us. Are we assuming that ancient people thought the same way we do? That everything must have a clear function, a defined use, a practical purpose? What if that assumption is wrong? What if these objects served a role that was understood intuitively at the time, but does not translate into our modern framework, something cultural, symbolic, experiential, something that was never meant to be explained in writing, because it didn't need to be? And if that's true, then perhaps the mystery is not in the object, but in the gap between their world and ours. Still, one detail continues to stand out: the distribution. These objects have been found across vast distances, different regions, different environments, and yet they share the same core design, which suggests coordination, knowledge being passed from place to place, a shared understanding. But of what and by whom? Because if this was a common practice, why does it leave no trace in history? Why does it appear and then disappear, as if it belonged to a layer of society we cannot see? A hidden function, a forgotten system, or something else entirely? There is also the question of intention. Creating these objects required skill, time, effort, precision. They were not accidental, they were not crude. Someone chose to make them this way. But why? What problem were they solving? Or were they not solving a problem at all? Perhaps they were not meant to be understood. Not in the way we understand things. Perhaps they were meant to be experienced, used in a context we have lost, a ritual, a practice, a system of meaning that has vanished. And if that is the case, then these objects are not just artifacts. They are fragments of a world we no longer have access to, a world where their purpose was obvious, but now is completely gone. As archaeologists continue to uncover more of these dodecahedrons, the pattern remains the same. No answers, only more examples, more variations, more confirmation that this was not an isolated phenomenon, but something widespread, something consistent, and yet something silent, because history, as we know it, is built on records, on writing, on documentation. But what happens when something leaves no record, when it exists but is never explained? Does it become less real or more mysterious? The Roman dodecahedrons sit in that space, between evidence and meaning, between presence and absence. They remind us that not everything in history can be understood through logic alone, that some things simply remain unresolved, and perhaps that is what makes them so powerful, not just what they are, but what they represent. A reminder that even in a civilization as advanced, as documented, and as studied as Rome, there are still gaps, still questions, still objects that refuse to tell us their story, and maybe they never will. Because sometimes the past doesn't just hide its secrets, it keeps them. The king who may never have existed. There are stories that begin as history and slowly transform into legend, not because they are false, but because the truth becomes impossible to separate from the myth. Names grow larger, details become blurred, facts begin to shift, until eventually what remains is not a clear memory, but a question. And few names in history carry that question more powerfully than this one, King Arthur. A name that echoes through centuries, a king of unmatched courage, a ruler of justice, a warrior who united a fractured land, a man who wielded a sword no one else could lift. And yet, there is a problem. No one can prove he ever existed. This is not just a gap in records, it is something far more unsettling. Because the story of King Arthur is not small. It is not obscure. It is one of the most influential legends in Western history, and still, its central figure may be nothing more than an idea. To understand why this mystery is so difficult to resolve, we have to return to a time when Britain was no longer under Roman control. The Roman Empire had withdrawn, its armies gone, its structures collapsing. What remained was a land in transition, unstable, divided, vulnerable. Different tribes competed for power, external forces pressed inward, and in the middle of this uncertainty, stories began to form. Stories of a leader, a figure who stood against chaos, who brought order where there was none, who defended the land from invasion. At first, these stories were simple, fragments, mentions in early writings, but even these earliest references are unclear. One of the first figures to mention Arthur was a 9th century writer known as Nennius. He describes Arthur not as a king, but as a warrior, a leader in battle, someone who fought against invading forces. But that's all. No grand kingdom, no magical sword, no knights, just a name. And even then, the details are limited. Then, centuries later, something changed. The story began to grow. Writers like Geoffrey of Monmouth took these fragments and expanded them. They added depth, detail, narrative. And suddenly, Arthur was no longer just a warrior. He was a king, a ruler of Camelot, a symbol of unity, the wielder of Excalibur, surrounded by legendary figures, Merlin, Lancelot, Guinevere. The story became richer, more complete, more powerful, but also more distant from reality. Because the more detailed the legend became, the less evidence there was to support it, and this is where the mystery deepens. Because despite centuries of storytelling, there is no definitive proof that King Arthur ever lived, no confirmed archaeological evidence, no verified historical records from his supposed time. Nothing that clearly places him as a real individual. And yet, the story refuses to disappear. which raises a question that historians still struggle with. Why does this legend persist so strongly if it has no clear foundation? One possibility is that Arthur was real, but not in the way we imagine. Perhaps he was not a king, but a military leader, a warlord, someone who lived during the chaotic period after Rome's withdrawal, a figure who led battles, who defended territories, who earned a reputation strong enough to be remembered. And over time, that memory grew, expanded, transformed into something greater. If this is true, then Arthur may not be a myth, but a distortion, a real person whose story evolved beyond recognition. But even this theory faces challenges. Because if such a leader existed, where are the records? Where are the records? Where are the remnants of his rule? The structures, the inscriptions, the evidence that usually accompanies power? They are missing, and that absence is difficult to ignore. So another theory emerges. What if Arthur was never a single person? What if he was many? A combination of different leaders, different warriors, different stories, merged together over time. This would explain the inconsistencies, the shifting details, the lack of a clear historical footprint. Arthur, in this sense, becomes less of an individual and more of a symbol, a constructed figure representing a period of resistance, a way for people to remember a time when they stood against invasion, a collective memory shaped into a single name. And if that is the case, then Arthur is not lost. He never existed in the first place. But there is another possibility, one that is more abstract, more difficult to define. What if Arthur was never meant to be real? What if he was created deliberately, not as a deception, but as a necessity? A figure designed to represent ideals, leadership, justice, unity. In a time of instability, people often turn to stories that give meaning, direction, hope. Arthur may have been one of those stories, a way to bring order to chaos, a narrative that people could believe in, and over time, belief can become something powerful enough to feel real. But even this explanation leaves questions, because the story of Arthur is not just symbolic, it is detailed, specific, filled with locations, events, connections. Places like Camelot, the Isle of Avalon, Tintagel. These are not abstract ideas, they are tied to real landscapes, real geography, which leads some to search for physical evidence. Excavations have been conducted, ruins examined, sites analysed, and while some findings suggest that important figures may have lived in these locations, nothing conclusively links them to Arthur. The connection remains uncertain, and that uncertainty is what keeps the mystery alive. Because the story exists in a strange space, it is too detailed to be entirely fictional, but too unsupported to be confirmed as history. It sits between the two, balanced, unresolved. And perhaps that is why it endures, because it cannot be closed, it cannot be finished, it invites interpretation. Speculation. Belief. Some choose to see Arthur as real, a lost king, a forgotten leader whose story was buried beneath time. Others see him as legend, a creation of imagination, a reflection of cultural values. And some see him as something in between, a fragment of truth, wrapped in layers of myth. But maybe the most important question is not whether Arthur existed. Maybe the real question is, why do we want him to? Why does this story matter so much? Why has it survived for so long? Because in the end, Arthur represents something deeper than history. He represents the idea that in times of darkness, someone will rise, someone will lead, someone will bring order to chaos. And whether that person was real or imagined, the impact is the same. The story shapes belief, and belief shapes reality. But still, the mystery remains, because somewhere in the gap between fact and fiction, there may be a truth, a real figure, a real moment, a real story that we have not yet uncovered, or perhaps never will, because some stories are not meant to be solved. They are meant to be told and retold. and retold and remembered, not for what they prove, but for what they represent. And King Arthur, whether he was a man, a myth, or something in between, remains one of history's most enduring questions. A name that refuses to fade, a story that refuses to settle, and a mystery that continues to echo through time. The ancient battery. There are discoveries that challenge what we know, and then there are discoveries that challenge what we believe is possible. Because sometimes an object doesn't just raise questions about itself, it raises questions about everything around it, about history, about knowledge, about how much we may have misunderstood the past. In 1938, near the ruins of an ancient city not far from modern-day Baghdad, an archaeologist uncovered something small. At first, it seemed insignificant, a simple clay jar, roughly shaped, modest in size, the kind of object that would normally be catalogued and stored away without much attention. But inside this jar was something strange, a copper cylinder, and inside that cylinder, an iron rod. 3 simple components: clay, copper, iron. Nothing extraordinary. Until someone asked a simple question: what happens if you add liquid? When researchers later experimented with similar replicas, they discovered something unexpected. When an acidic liquid, like vinegar or wine, was poured into the jar, it produced a small electric current, electricity, from an object that was over 2,000 years old. This artifact would come to be known as the Baghdad Battery, and from the moment its potential was realized, it became one of the most controversial objects in ancient history. Because if this interpretation is correct, it means that ancient civilizations may have understood electricity, not in theory, but in practice, long before it was officially discovered, and that idea changes everything. To understand why this is so unsettling, we need to consider the timeline we believe in. Electricity as we understand it today is a relatively modern development. Its principles were explored in the last few centuries, its applications refined over time, its power harnessed through technology that required advanced scientific understanding. But the Baghdad Battery suggests something very different. It suggests that thousands of years ago, someone may have already discovered a way to generate electrical energy, even if only in small amounts. The immediate reaction to this idea is skepticism. It feels too far outside what we expect. So naturally, alternative explanations were proposed. Perhaps the object wasn't a battery at all. Perhaps it was just a container, a storage vessel for scrolls or sacred items. The metal components could have had a different purpose, something unrelated to electricity. This is the mainstream view, and it is supported by one key point. There is no direct evidence that the ancient Mesopotamians used electricity in a widespread or documented way. No wires, no electrical devices, no written descriptions of electrical experiments. And yet, the structure of the object remains difficult to ignore, because when you look at it closely, it seems intentional. The combination of materials, the arrangement, the way the components fit together, it resembles something functional, something designed, and that design aligns almost perfectly with a basic electrochemical cell, which raises a difficult question. Was this a coincidence, or was it knowledge? If it was knowledge, then what was it used for? This is where the theories begin to expand. One possibility is that the Baghdad battery was used for electroplating, a process where a thin layer of metal is deposited onto another surface using electricity. This technique could have been used to coat objects in gold or silver, to create decorative items that appeared more valuable than they were. Interestingly, some ancient artifacts show signs of metal coating, but the connection is not definitive. There is no clear proof that the battery was used for this purpose, only the possibility. Another theory suggests something even more unusual, that the battery may have been used for medical purposes. Primitive electrotherapy. The idea that small electric currents could have been applied to the body for healing or stimulation. It sounds surprising, but even in later periods, electricity was experimented with in medicine. Could this have been an early version of that concept? Again, there is no direct evidence, only speculation. And that is where the mystery deepens. Because every explanation seems possible, but none are confirmed. And then there is the question that sits beneath all of this. If the Baghdad battery truly generated electricity, why didn't this knowledge spread? Why didn't it evolve? Why didn't it become a foundation for further technological development? Because history shows us that useful discoveries tend to grow. They expand, they lead to new inventions. But in this case, the trail ends. There is no clear progression, no line connecting this object to future advancements. It appears and then disappears, which leads to a more unsettling possibility. What if this knowledge was not developed further because it was lost, not gradually forgotten, but suddenly interrupted? Ancient civilizations rose and fell, empires collapsed, libraries burned, knowledge vanished. Entire systems of understanding could disappear within a generation. If the Baghdad battery was part of a broader knowledge system, then it's possible that system no longer exists. What we are seeing is just a fragment, a surviving piece of something larger, something we no longer have access to. And that idea is difficult to ignore, because this is not the only artifact that challenges our understanding of ancient technology. There are other examples, other objects that seem out of place, too advanced, too precise, too unexpected. And while each one can be explained individually, together they form a pattern that suggests something we are not fully seeing. But not everyone agrees. Many scholars argue that the Baghdad battery is being misunderstood, that we are projecting modern ideas onto ancient objects, that just because something resembles a battery does not mean it was used as one. This is a valid concern, because interpretation is powerful. We often see what we expect to see, but even with that caution, the question remains: why this design? Why this combination of materials? Why this structure? If it was not meant to produce electricity, then what was it meant to do? And why does it align so closely with something we recognize today? These questions do not have clear answers, and perhaps that is what makes this artifact so compelling. It sits at the edge of understanding, close enough to be explained, but far enough to remain uncertain. And in that uncertainty, there is tension. Because if the Baghdad battery is what it appears to be, then our understanding of ancient history is incomplete. Not slightly, but significantly. It would mean that knowledge existed earlier than we thought, that discovery is not always linear, that ideas can emerge and then disappear. And if that is true, then what else have we missed? What other discoveries were made only to be lost? What technologies were understood only to vanish? The past is often seen as a foundation, a starting point. But perhaps it is more complex than that. Perhaps it is layered, with moments of advancement followed by periods of loss, knowledge rising and falling, and the Baghdad battery may be one of those moments, a brief spark, a glimpse of something that existed and then faded, leaving behind only questions. Because in the end, we are left with an object, a simple jar, with a copper cylinder and an iron rod, an object that can generate electricity, but does not explain why. And maybe that is the most unsettling part, not what it is, but what it suggests. That the past may not be as simple as we believe, that history may not be as complete as it seems, and that somewhere long before we began to understand electricity, someone else may have already touched it. The secret cult that left no secrets. There are religions we understand. They leave behind texts, teachings, clear beliefs. They explain themselves. But then there are others, religions that existed in the shadows, practiced in secrecy, hidden from the public, known only to those who initiated. And when they disappear, they leave behind almost nothing. No clear doctrine, no written explanations, no complete understanding. Only fragments, symbols, ruins, echoes of something we can no longer fully grasp. Among the many mysteries of the ancient world, few are as elusive as this one. A powerful religious cult that spread across the Roman Empire, yet refused to reveal itself. A belief system followed by soldiers, officials, and ordinary men alike, but practiced in silence. A religion that thrived for centuries and then vanished. This is the mystery of Mithraism, At first glance, it seems like just another ancient religion, centered around a figure known as Mithras, a god associated with strength, loyalty, and cosmic order, often depicted as a young man kneeling over a bull, driving a blade into its body. This image appears again and again, carved into stone, etched into reliefs, hidden within underground temples. It is known as the Tall Rock Tony, and it is the central symbol of Mithraism. But here's the problem. No one knows exactly what it means. Despite decades of research, centuries of study, the true meaning of this image remains uncertain, which is unusual. Because most religions explain their symbols. They provide context, stories, interpretations, but Mithraism does not, and that is where the mystery begins. Because this was not a small, isolated belief. It spread widely, from Rome to Britain to North Africa, across vast distances, followed by thousands, possibly more, and yet it left behind no central text, no scripture, no written explanation of its beliefs. Imagine that, a religion practiced across an empire with no clear written doctrine, only symbols and rituals. This is what makes Mithraism so difficult to understand, because what we know comes almost entirely from archaeology, from the places where it was practiced, the temples, known as Mithraea. These were not grand buildings, not open spaces. They were hidden, often underground, small enclosed chambers designed to feel separate from the outside world. Entering a Mithraeum would not feel like entering a public place. It would feel like stepping into something private, something secret. The space was narrow, with benches along the sides, an altar at the far end, and always the image of Mithras killing the bull, watching, silent. The design suggests something important. These were not places for large gatherings. They were intimate, restricted, which aligns with what we know about the cult. It was exclusive. Not everyone could join, and those who did went through initiation. But here's where things become even more unclear. We don't know exactly what those initiations involved. There are hints, fragments, mentions of stages, levels of progression, 7 to be precise, each associated with a symbol, a role, possibly even a planet, raven, bridegroom, soldier, lion, Persian, sunrunner, father, each level representing advancement, transformation, but what happened within those stages remains unknown. Some believe that initiates underwent trials, symbolic experiences of death and rebirth, moments designed to change them, to reshape their understanding of life. Others suggest that the rituals may have involved reenactments, ceremonies tied to the central myth of Mithras. But without written records, these ideas remain speculation, and that absence is difficult to explain. Why would a religion so widespread leave behind so little explanation? Was it intentional? Was secrecy part of its core? It appears so, because unlike other religions of the time, Mithraism did not seek public attention. It did not build large temples in open spaces. It did not promote itself widely. It existed quietly, within closed circles, shared only among those who were initiated. And this secrecy raises a deeper question. What were they protecting? What knowledge was considered too important or too powerful to be written down? Some historians believe that Mithraism was heavily influenced by earlier Persian beliefs, that the figure of Mithras originated in ancient Iran and was later adapted by the Romans. But even with this connection, the Roman version of Mithraism is distinct, unique. It developed its own structure, its own symbols, its own practices, which suggests that it evolved, that it became something new. But again, we do not know how or why. Then there is another detail, one that adds another layer to the mystery. Mithraism was almost exclusively male. Its followers were men, often soldiers, members of the Roman military, which is significant because soldiers were constantly moving, traveling across regions, carrying ideas with them. This may explain how the cult spread so widely. But it also raises another question. Why soldiers? What was it about this belief system that appealed specifically to them? Some suggest that Mithraism offered structure, a sense of brotherhood, a clear path of progression. In a world of uncertainty and conflict, it provided order, purpose, and perhaps something more, something deeper, something that could not be easily explained. But then, it disappeared. Gradually, quietly. As another religion began to rise, Christianity. By the 4th century, Christianity had gained influence, power, support from the state, and as it expanded, other belief systems began to fade, including Mithraism. Temples were abandoned, rituals ceased, followers disappeared, and just like that, a religion that once spanned an empire was gone. But unlike others, it did not leave behind a clear legacy. No preserved texts, no detailed accounts, just fragments and questions, which leads to one of the most intriguing possibilities. What if Mithraism did not disappear completely? What if elements of it were absorbed? There are similarities between Mithraism and early Christianity. Themes of salvation, light and darkness, a savior figure, even shared symbolic elements. These parallels have led some to speculate that Mithraism may have influenced early Christian practices, but this idea is debated, contested, and not fully proven. Still, the similarities remain, and they add another layer to an already complex mystery, because if Mithraism influenced other belief systems, then its disappearance may not have been a true ending, but a transformation, a shift from one form into another. But without clear evidence, we cannot say for certain, and that uncertainty is what defines this mystery. Because we are left with a religion that was real, that existed, that was practiced by thousands, and yet we do not know what its followers truly believed. We do not know what they experienced, what they learned, what they understood, only that it mattered deeply, enough to be kept secret, enough to be protected, and perhaps enough to be lost. Because in the end, Mithraism reminds us of something important. Not all history is visible. Not all knowledge is recorded. Some things exist in silence, in hidden spaces, in moments that were never meant to be shared. And when those things disappear, they leave behind something unusual. Not just absence, but mystery. A sense that something was there, something meaningful, something important that we can no longer access. And maybe that was always the point, because some secrets are not lost, they are kept. The image that should not exist. There are objects that hold history, and then there are objects that seem to challenge it, because sometimes an artifact doesn't just belong to the past, it seems to resist explanation entirely. Not because we lack information, but because every explanation leads to contradiction. Few objects capture this tension more than a single piece of cloth, a simple fabric, worn, faded, ancient, and yet possibly one of the most debated artifacts in human history. This is the mystery of the Shroud of Turin. At first glance, it appears unremarkable, a long strip of linen, discolored with age. But when you look closer, you begin to see something else. An image, faint, almost ghost-like, the outline of a human figure. A man, his face barely visible, his body stretched across the fabric, and most striking of all, marks, wounds, patterns that seem to match the injuries of crucifixion, nail marks in the wrists, a wound in the side, scars consistent with physical trauma. To many, this is not just an image, it is evidence. Believed to be the burial cloth of Jesus, a direct imprint of his body. But belief is only one part of the story, because the Shroud of Turin is not just a religious artifact, it is also a scientific mystery, one that has been studied, tested, and debated for decades. And despite all that effort, it remains unresolved. The history of the shroud, at least the documented part, begins in the 14th century. It appeared in France, displayed publicly, claimed to be a sacred relic, but almost immediately, questions arose. Because there were no clear records of the shroud before that time, no mention of it in earlier Christian texts, no documented journey from the time of Christ to medieval Europe. It simply appeared, which led some to believe that it was a creation of that period, a relic made to inspire belief, or perhaps to serve a purpose, religious, political, cultural. But then, the image itself became the focus, because it didn't behave like a normal painting, or a stain, or any known form of artistic creation. When scientists examined it, they found something unusual. The image is not made with paint. There are no brush strokes, no pigments in the traditional sense. Instead, the discoloration appears to be limited to the very top fibers of the cloth, microscopic, as if the image was not applied, but somehow formed. And this is where things become difficult to explain, because despite extensive testing, no one has been able to fully replicate the image, not with the same properties, not with the same properties. It behaves almost like a photographic negative. When the image is inverted, the details become clearer, more defined. This discovery, made in the 19th century, added a new layer to the mystery, because photography did not exist in the 14th century. So how could such an effect appear on a medieval cloth? This question led to further investigation. In 1988, carbon dating tests were conducted, a scientific method used to determine the age of organic material. The results seemed clear. The shroud dated back to between 1260 and 1390, medieval, not ancient, not from the time of Christ. For many, this settled the debate. The shroud was not authentic. It was a product of the Middle Ages, but the story did not end there, because the carbon dating results were questioned. Critics argued that the samples tested may not have been representative of the entire cloth, that the area used had been repaired, contaminated, altered over time. If that were true, then the results could be inaccurate. And so the uncertainty returned. Further studies were conducted, more analysis, more debate. Some researchers pointed to the presence of pollen grains from plants found in the Middle East. Others examined the bloodstains, the way they aligned with the image, the way they appeared to behave like real blood, not paint, not artificial, but again, nothing conclusive. Each piece of evidence seemed to support one theory while contradicting another. Which brings us to the central question: how was the image created? There are several possibilities. Some suggest it was painted, a work of art, created with skill and intention. But this theory struggles to explain the lack of pigment, the absence of brushstrokes, the unique properties of the image. Others propose a chemical reaction, that the body of a person wrapped in the cloth caused a reaction over time, leaving behind an imprint. But this too has limitations. It does not fully explain the clarity, the detail, the negative light quality. Then there are more unconventional ideas, that the image was created by a burst of energy, radiation, light, some form of release at the moment of death, or something beyond that, something we do not fully understand. These theories move away from traditional science, but they persist because conventional explanations fall short, and that is what keeps this mystery alive. Because no matter which explanation you consider, there is always something missing, something that doesn't fit. And perhaps that is what makes the Shroud of Turin so compelling. It exists at the intersection of belief and evidence, of faith and science, each side interpreting it differently, each finding support for its position, but neither able to fully resolve it. For believers, the shroud is a sacred object, a physical connection to a historical figure, a moment preserved in time. For skeptics, it is a creation, a powerful artifact, but one made by human hands. And for scientists, it is a problem. An object that does not behave as expected, that resists clear classification, that continues to raise questions, even after decades of study. But beyond the debate, there is something else, something quieter, something more subtle. Because the power of the shroud is not just in what it is, but in what it represents. It represents uncertainty, the limits of knowledge, the space between what we can prove and what we believe. It reminds us that not all questions have answers, that some objects exist not to be explained, but to be explored, and perhaps even to be doubted, because doubt is part of the process, part of understanding. But so is curiosity, and the Shroud of Turin continues to inspire both. It draws people in, invites examination, challenges assumptions, and remains unresolved. Because even now, with all our technology, all our knowledge, all our methods, we still cannot say with certainty what it is or how it was made. And maybe that uncertainty is what gives it power, because in a world where so much is explained, there is something compelling about what is not, something that resists definition, that remains open, that continues to ask questions without offering answers. And the Shroud of Turin is one of those questions, a piece of cloth, an image, a mystery that refuses to settle, and perhaps never will. The empire that vanished without a fight. Empires do not simply disappear, they weaken, they fracture, they fall apart piece by piece. At least that's what we expect, because something as vast, as powerful, and as organized as an empire does not just stop. It resists collapse. It leaves behind signs, warnings, a slow unraveling that historians can trace. But sometimes history does something unexpected. Sometimes an empire doesn't collapse loudly. It fades quietly, almost gently, until one day it is simply gone. This is the mystery of Roman Britain. For nearly 4 centuries, Rome ruled the island. They built cities, roads, fortresses. They brought order, structure, and control to a land that had once been divided. From the south of England to the edges of the north, Roman influence shaped daily life. Towns thrived. Trade flowed. Infrastructure connected distant regions. And standing at the edge of it all was a wall, massive. Stone, unyielding, Hadrian's Wall, a boundary between 2 worlds. On one side, Rome, on the other, uncertainty. It was not just a defensive structure, it was a statement, a line that said, "This far and no further." For generations, Roman soldiers stood watch along that wall, maintaining order, protecting the province, ensuring that Britain remained part of the empire. But then, something changed. Not suddenly, not violently, but steadily, subtly. The signs began to appear. Fortresses that once housed soldiers started to empty. Roads fell into disrepair. Cities once vibrant began to decline. Trade slowed. Resources became scarce. At first, these changes may not have seemed alarming. Empires go through phases, periods of strength and weakness. But this was different, because the support from Rome was fading. And then, around the early 5th century, it stopped. Completely, the Roman Empire, facing pressures across its vast territories, made a decision, a quiet one, but a significant one. They withdrew, not in a dramatic evacuation, not with a final stand, but gradually. Soldiers were reassigned, resources redirected, attention shifted elsewhere, and Britain was left on its own. One of the most telling moments comes from a letter sent by the Roman Emperor Honorius to the cities of Britain. Its message was simple: defend yourselves. That was it. After centuries of rule, Rome was gone, and Britain was no longer part of the empire. But here is where the mystery begins, because this departure does not follow the pattern we expect. There is no clear record of chaos, no widespread destruction marking the end, no singular event that defines the collapse. Instead, there is silence, a gradual disappearance, as if the structures of Roman Britain simply stopped functioning. Cities were abandoned, not burned, not destroyed, just left. Homes emptied, buildings fell into disuse, life changed, but without a clear break, without a defining moment. And that is what makes this so unusual. Because empires usually leave scars when they fall, visible damage, evidence of conflict. But in this case, the evidence is incomplete, fragmented, difficult to interpret. So what happened? Why did Roman Britain collapse in this way? The most straightforward explanation points to external pressure. The Roman Empire by this time was under threat. Invasions on multiple fronts, internal instability, economic strain. Resources were stretched thin, and Britain was far away, difficult to defend, expensive to maintain. So from a strategic perspective, it made sense to withdraw, to focus on more immediate threats. But this explanation, while logical, does not fully account for the speed of the decline. Because once the Roman presence faded, the structures they had built began to collapse rapidly. Urban life diminished. Trade networks broke down. Systems that had been stable for centuries stopped. Why? Why would a society that had functioned under Roman rule for so long struggle so quickly without it? Some historians suggest economic collapse, that the system supporting Roman Britain were dependent on the empire, that without its resources, the economy could not sustain itself. Currency lost value, trade routes weakened, supplies dwindled, and gradually, the system failed. Others point to cultural factors, that Roman Britain was not fully unified, that beneath the surface local traditions remained, and when Roman authority disappeared, those traditions resurfaced. Communities turned inward, local identities became stronger, the centralized structure dissolved, and with it, the cohesion of the province. But even this does not fully explain the transition, because there is another detail that complicates the story. The speed. Archaeological evidence suggests that many Roman sites were abandoned relatively quickly, not over centuries, but within decades, which raises an uncomfortable question. Was there something else happening? Something we don't fully understand? Some have proposed environmental factors, climate change, crop failures, shifts in weather patterns, events that could have disrupted agriculture, leading to food shortages, instability, population movement. If the land could no longer support its people, then abandonment becomes more likely. But again, the evidence is limited. There are hints, indicators, but nothing definitive. And then there are the more speculative ideas, that the collapse was not entirely passive, that there may have been conflict, but one that was not fully recorded, that local uprisings, internal struggles, or even external incursions played a role, but left little trace. Because not all conflicts leave clear evidence, not all battles are documented, especially in a time when record-keeping was declining. Which brings us back to the central mystery. Not just why Roman Britain collapsed, but how it did so with so little clarity. Because what we see is not a dramatic fall, but a fading, a transformation from a structured, organized province to something less defined, less connected, less visible in the historical record. And that transition is difficult to map, difficult to explain, because it exists in fragments, pieces of evidence, partial stories, clues that suggest change but do not fully describe it. And perhaps that is the most important part of this mystery, that it challenges our expectations. It reminds us that not all historical events follow clear patterns, that some changes are gradual, subtle, difficult to detect in real time, until they are complete, until what once existed no longer does. And maybe that is what happened in Roman Britain. Not a collapse, but a withdrawal, a slow release of control, followed by a rapid shift in society, a change that was not marked by a single moment, but by a series of quiet decisions, small adjustments, until eventually the connection was gone, and what remained was something new, something different, but also something less visible, less documented, more uncertain. Because as the Roman presence disappeared, so did the systems that recorded it, and with them, the clarity we rely on to understand the past. Which leaves us with a mystery, not of destruction, but of disappearance. An empire that ruled for centuries, leaving behind structures, roads, and walls, but no clear explanation for its departure, no definitive answer for its end, only traces, remnants, and questions. Because somewhere in that transition something happened, something that changed the course of history, but left behind only fragments. And perhaps that is why it remains so compelling, because it forces us to accept something difficult, that even the most powerful systems can fade, not with a crash, but with a quiet absence. And when they do, understanding what happened becomes one of the hardest challenges of all. The books that were erased. There are stories that survive, passed down, preserved, protected, written into history so they can never be forgotten. But there are others that disappear, not lost by accident, not destroyed by time alone, but removed, silenced, erased. Because sometimes the most powerful ideas are not the ones we remember. They are the ones we remember and meant to see. In the early centuries of Christianity, something unusual was happening. The religion was not yet unified, not yet defined. It was growing, spreading across regions, adapting, evolving. And with that growth came diversity, different interpretations, different beliefs, different versions of the same story. Communities formed around these ideas, each one holding its own understanding of who Jesus was, what his teachings meant, what salvation looked like. There was no single agreed-upon narrative, not yet. And in that space, something remarkable existed. A wide range of texts, gospels, letters, teachings, writings that explored ideas far beyond what we recognize today. Some of these texts still exist. Fragments, copies, rediscovered pieces. But many do not. They are missing, and not in a vague sense. Entire works, known to have existed, referenced by early writers, quoted, discussed, but no longer available, gone. This is the mystery of the lost early Christian texts. At first, it may seem like a simple case of time. Ancient manuscripts are fragile. They decay. They are damaged, destroyed by fire, war, or neglect. And that is true. Many texts were lost in this way, but not all, because some disappearances feel intentional. To understand this, we need to look at a critical moment in history, the formation of the biblical canon, the process by which certain texts were chosen to be included in the New Testament, while others were excluded. This was not a quick decision. It took centuries, debates, councils, disagreements, religious leaders discussing which writings were authoritative, which aligned with their understanding of truth, and which did not. And in that process, choices were made. Some texts were accepted, preserved, copied again and again, ensuring their survival. Others were rejected, labeled as incorrect, dangerous, even heretical. And once a text was labeled heretical, its fate was often sealed. Because in a time when religious authority was closely tied to power, controlling belief meant controlling information. Texts that challenged the dominant narrative were not just ignored, they were suppressed. And over time, they disappeared. One of the most well-known examples is the Gospel of Thomas. Unlike the traditional Gospels, it does not tell a story. There is no narrative of birth, death, or resurrection. Instead, it is a collection of sayings, teachings attributed to Jesus. Some of these sayings are familiar, echoes of what we see in the New Testament. But others are very different. They focus on inner knowledge, personal discovery, a more direct connection to the divine, without the same structure of authority, without the same emphasis on external salvation. And that difference was significant because it presented an alternative, a different way of understanding faith, which may explain why it was excluded, not because it lacked value, but because it did not align with the direction the church was moving. And the Gospel of Thomas is not alone. There are other texts, the Gospel of Mary, the Gospel of Judas, writings attributed to early Christian figures, each offering a slightly different perspective, a different interpretation. And each one, outside the canon, outside the official narrative. But perhaps the most intriguing part of this mystery is not just what was excluded, but how much may still be missing. Because for every text we have rediscovered, there may be many more that are completely lost. Texts we know existed only because they were mentioned, quoted in passing, referenced by early writers, that never preserved, never copied, never found. And that raises a difficult question. What ideas did those texts contain? What perspectives, what interpretations, what versions of the story have we never seen? Because history, as we understand it, is shaped by what survives, by what is preserved. But if certain ideas were removed, then our understanding is incomplete. Not wrong, but limited. And that limitation is important, because it means that early Christianity may have been far more diverse than we realize, more complex, more varied, with different groups exploring different paths. And over time, those paths narrowed, converged into a single direction, a unified structure, defined by specific texts, specific beliefs. But the traces of that earlier diversity remain, hidden in fragments, in discoveries like the Nag Hammadi Library, a collection of ancient texts found in Egypt in 1945, buried, preserved, forgotten, until they were uncovered. These texts provided a glimpse into a different version of early Christianity, one that had been largely erased, not completely destroyed, but hidden. And their existence suggests something important, that not all texts were lost by accident. Some were deliberately set aside, buried, protected, or perhaps hidden. But why? Why would these ideas be removed? One possibility is control. As the early church grew, it needed structure, consistency, a clear doctrine. Too many interpretations could lead to division, instability, so establishing a unified belief system became essential. And in doing so, alternative views were excluded, not necessarily because they were false, but because they did not fit. And over time, those views faded. But there is another possibility, one that is more unsettling. What if some of these texts were not just different, but challenging? What if they presented ideas that questioned authority, that offered individuals a more direct connection to belief, without the need for intermediaries? If that were the case, then preserving those texts could have been seen as a risk, and removing them a way to maintain order. But without the texts themselves, we cannot know for certain. And that is what makes this mystery so compelling. Because it is not just about what was lost. It is about what was chosen, what was kept, and what was left behind. It is about the shaping of history, not just through events, but through decisions. Because every document we have, every text we read, is part of a larger process. A process that determined what would survive, and what would not. And in that process, some voices were preserved, and others silenced. But even silence leaves traces, fragments, clues, hints of something more. And as new discoveries are made, as new texts are uncovered, we begin to see glimpses of what was once there. A broader picture, a more complex beginning, but still incomplete, still missing pieces. Because some texts may never be found, lost to time, destroyed, or hidden beyond reach. And with them, ideas, perspectives, possibilities that we can only imagine. Which leaves us with a question, not just about the past, but about understanding. How much of what we know is shaped by what remains, and how much is shaped by what was removed? Because history is not just a record, it is a selection, a collection of what survived. And sometimes, what survives is not the full story, and the lost texts of early Christianity are a reminder of that. A reminder that beneath what we know, there may be layers we have never seen, stories we have never heard, truths we have never explored, and perhaps never will. The symbols that disappeared. There are objects in history that carry meaning, and then there are objects that carry power, not physical power, not strength or force, but something deeper, something symbolic, something that represents identity itself. Because sometimes an object is not just an object, it is everything a civilization believes about itself. And losing it means losing more than just a physical thing. It means losing pride, honor, authority. In the Roman Empire, there was one symbol that embodied all of this. A single object carried into battle, protected above all else, feared, revered, untouchable. It was known as the aquila, the eagle standard. Each Roman legion had one, a golden eagle mounted on a staff. It was not just decoration, it was sacred, the heart of the legion. Soldiers would follow it into battle, fight for it, die for it. Because as long as the eagle stood, the legion stood. But if it fell, everything fell with it. To lose an eagle standard was not just defeat, it was humiliation, a stain on the honor of Rome itself. And yet, there were moments in history when these symbols were lost, not misplaced, not damaged, captured, taken by enemies, and then disappeared. This is the mystery of the lost Roman eagle standards. It begins with one of the most devastating defeats Rome ever faced, a battle deep within a dense forest, a place where visibility was limited, where the terrain was unpredictable, where the Roman military machine was at a disadvantage. In the year 9 AD, 3 Roman legions marched into Germania, led by a general named Publius Quintilius Varus. Their mission seemed routine: to maintain control, to reinforce Roman authority. But what awaited them was not a routine conflict. It was an ambush, carefully planned, executed with precision, by forces that understood the land far better than the Romans ever could. As the legions moved through the forest, they were surrounded, attacked from all sides, cut off from formation, unable to respond in the structured way they were trained for. What followed was not just a defeat, it was annihilation. Thousands of soldiers were killed, entire legions wiped out, and among the losses were the eagle standards, captured by the Germanic tribes. For Rome, this was more than a military disaster. It was a psychological blow. The loss of 3 eagles was unthinkable, because these symbols were not meant to fall into enemy hands, and yet they had. What happened to them afterward is unclear. Some accounts suggest they were taken as trophies, displayed as symbols of victory, proof that Rome could be defeated. Others believe they were hidden, buried, or even destroyed. But there is no definitive record, no confirmed location, no physical trace, just the knowledge that they were lost, and that loss lingering. Years later, efforts were made to recover them. Roman forces returned, campaigns were launched, and eventually some of the lost standards were reportedly retrieved. But even this part of the story is uncertain. Details are vague, records incomplete, and not all the eagles were accounted for, which means some may still be missing, lost somewhere in the forests, or perhaps gone forever. But this was not the only time Rome lost its symbols. Decades earlier, another disaster had taken place. Far from the forests of Germania, in the open plains of the east, a battle between Rome and the Parthian Empire. In 53 BC, a Roman army led by Marcus Licinius Crassus marched into unfamiliar territory. Confident, powerful, unprepared, the Parthians fought differently. They used mobility, distance, precision, attacking from afar, avoiding direct confrontation. And the Roman legions could not adapt. The result was devastating. Crassus was killed, his army destroyed, and once again, the eagle standards were lost, captured by the enemy, taken far from Rome. This time, the humiliation was immense, because the loss was not just military, it was symbolic. Rome, the dominant power of the time, had been defeated, and its most sacred symbols taken. What happened to these standards afterward is even more uncertain. Some accounts suggest they were kept by the Parthians, displayed as proof of their victory. Others claim they were eventually returned, negotiated, recovered through diplomacy rather than war. But again, the details are unclear. incomplete. And that is what makes this mystery so persistent. Because these were not ordinary objects, they were central to Roman identity, tracked, recorded, valued. And yet their fate remains uncertain, which raises a deeper question. How does something so important become so unclear in history? Because Rome documented everything: victories, defeats, movements. Their records were extensive, detailed, and yet in these cases we are left with gaps. Moments where the story becomes difficult to follow, where the trail fades and the answers disappear. Some historians believe that the lack of clarity is intentional, that the Romans, embarrassed by these losses, chose not to preserve the full details, that the narrative was adjusted, simplified, focused on recovery rather than defeat, because admitting such losses could weaken the image of strength. But even if that is true, it does not explain everything, because physical objects should leave traces, especially ones made of precious metals, especially ones held as trophies. And yet, no confirmed remains of these lost standards have ever been found, which leads to speculation that they may have been melted down, destroyed, repurposed, or hidden in places we have not yet discovered. But without evidence, these remain possibilities, not answers. And that uncertainty is what gives this mystery its weight, because it is not just about objects, it is about what they represent: power, identity, control, and what happens when those things are lost. Because the disappearance of the eagle standards is not just a historical detail, it is a symbol of vulnerability, a reminder that even the most powerful empires can lose what defines them, and sometimes those losses cannot be fully explained. Because history, for all its records and documentation, is not complete. There are moments where clarity fades, where events are only partially understood, where objects that should be accounted for are not, and the eagle standards exist in that space, between record and absence, between certainty and mystery. They were real, they were lost, and their final fate remains unknown. But perhaps the most interesting question is not where they are, but what their disappearance tells us. Because if something so important, so central, so carefully protected, can vanish without a clear explanation, then what else might be missing? What other symbols, what other objects, what other pieces of history have disappeared in the same way? Unrecorded, unresolved, unanswered. Because the past is not just what we remember, it is also what we have lost. And sometimes what we have lost matters the most. The lines that can only be seen from the sky, there are marks humans leave behind. Footprints in the sand, carvings in stone, structures that rise above the land. They are meant to be seen, understood, recognized. But what happens when something is created that cannot be seen from the ground? Something so vast, so precise that its true form only reveals itself from above? In the dry, silent plains of southern Peru, there is a place where the earth itself has been transformed into a canvas, a place where lines stretch across the desert floor for miles. Straight lines, perfect angles, geometric shapes, and then figures, enormous figures. A hummingbird, a spider, a monkey, drawn with such scale that standing beside them, you would not even realize what you were looking at. Because from the ground, they don't make sense. They are too large, too spread out, too abstract. Only when viewed from the sky do they come together, forming images that seem almost impossible. These are the Nazca lines, and they are one of the most enduring mysteries in the world. At first, the explanation seems simple. They were created by the Nazca people, a civilization that existed between 200 BC and 600 C. They removed the top layer of dark stones from the desert surface, revealing the lighter soil beneath, creating contrast, forming lines, shapes, figures. And because the region is so dry with almost no rain, these markings have survived for centuries, preserved, untouched, still visible today. But knowing how they were made does not explain why, or how they were designed. Because the scale of these figures raises a question that is difficult to ignore. How do you create something this large, without seeing it from above. There is no evidence that the Nazca people had any form of flight, no balloons, no elevated platforms large enough to provide a full view, no tools that would allow them to see the complete design during construction. And yet, the proportions are accurate, the lines are consistent, the shapes are recognizable, which suggests planning, precision, an understanding of scale. But from where? One explanation is that the Nazca used simple techniques, grids, markers, careful measurements. By dividing the designs into smaller sections, they could replicate larger images, piece by piece, without needing to see the whole. This is possible. It aligns with known methods of construction. But even so, it requires a level of coordination and accuracy that is remarkable, especially for a civilization without advanced tools. And that still leaves the question of purpose. Why create something so massive if it cannot be seen from the ground? Some researchers believe the lines had astronomical significance, that they align with celestial events, the movement of the sun, the positions of stars, serving as a kind of calendar, a way to track time, seasons, cycles. This theory gained attention because certain lines appear to point toward the horizon at specific angles, possibly marking solstices or other events. But over time, this explanation has been challenged. Because while some alignments exist, many do not. The patterns are not consistent enough to confirm a purely astronomical purpose, so the search for meaning continues. Another theory suggests that the lines were part of religious rituals, that they were pathways, used in ceremonies, walked along as part of spiritual practices. The figures themselves, representing deities, symbols of nature, elements connected to water and fertility. In a desert environment, water was life, scarce, unpredictable, and the Nazca people may have created these geoglyphs as offerings, as a way to communicate with the gods, to ask for rain, for survival. This idea has support because some lines lead to water sources, others are located near areas of cultural importance. But again, it does not fully explain the scale or the complexity, because if the lines were meant for rituals on the ground, why make them so large? Why design them in a way that only becomes clear from above, unless they were meant to be seen from above? And that is where the mystery becomes more unsettling. Because if the lines were designed for a viewpoint that the creators themselves could not access, then who were they for? Some have suggested that the lines were meant for the gods, that the Nazca people believed their deities watched from the sky, and the geoglyphs were a form of communication, messages drawn on the earth, visible to something beyond human perspective. It is a powerful idea, one that fits within the spiritual framework of ancient cultures, but it also raises questions. Because the precision of the lines suggests more than symbolic intent, it suggests understanding, control, design, and that leads to more speculative theories. Some propose that the Nazca had access to knowledge we do not fully understand, that they possessed techniques or methods that allowed them to visualize these designs from above, not through flight, but through geometry, through planning, through systems that have been lost. Others go further, suggesting that the lines may have had a purpose we cannot interpret, that they were part of a larger system, a network of meaning that does not translate into our understanding of function. Because not everything in the past was created for practical use. Some things were created for belief, for expression, for reasons that do not align with modern logic. And then there are the more controversial ideas, the ones that step outside conventional explanation, that suggest the lines were not created entirely by humans, that their scale, their precision, their visibility from the air indicate something else, something external. These theories are often dismissed because they lack evidence, but they persist because the mystery itself remains unresolved. And when answers are incomplete, speculation fills the space. But even without these theories, the Nazca lines remain extraordinary because they represent something we cannot fully explain. Not just how they were made, but why they were made in this way, why this scale, why this design, why this location, and why do they continue for miles without a clear unified pattern? Because while some figures are recognizable, others are abstract, lines that stretch into the distance, intersecting, overlapping, forming patterns that seem intentional, but not fully understood. It is as if the desert holds a language, one that was once known, but is now forgotten, and the lines are its remnants, still visible, still present, but no longer readable. As time passes, the Nazca lines continue to endure, protected by the environment, preserved by the lack of rain, but threatened by something else: modern activity, human movement. Because these lines, so vast and yet so fragile, can be damaged easily, a single track, a single disturbance, and a piece of the design is altered, changed, lost, which adds another layer to the mystery. Because what we see today may not be complete. There may have been more figures, more patterns, more meaning that has already disappeared. And with it, clues, answers, possibilities, leaving us with what remains. A desert filled with lines, figures that only make sense from the sky, creations that challenge our understanding, and questions that continue to echo. Because in the end, the Nazca lines are not just drawings, they are a message. One we can see, but not fully understand. A message written across the earth itself. Visible for centuries, and still unanswered. The voice is written in lead. There are many ways people try to control their lives. Through effort, through law, through power. But when those fail, something else emerges, something quieter, something hidden. A belief that there are forces beyond the visible world, forces that can be influenced, persuaded, even commanded. And in ancient Rome, there was a way to reach those forces, not through grand rituals, not through public ceremonies, but through something small, something simple, something deeply personal. A piece of metal, cold, heavy, inscribed with words meant to harm, to bind, to curse. These were known as curse tablets, and they are among the most unsettling artifacts ever discovered. At first glance, they seem insignificant. Thin sheets of lead, sometimes folded, sometimes pierced, often buried, hidden in places where they were unlikely to be found. But when unfolded, when examined, they reveal something far more disturbing. Messages directed at individuals, specific names, specific requests. Requests for suffering, for failure, for pain, for destruction. These were not symbolic. They were not vague. They were precise, intentional, personal. One tablet might ask for a rival to lose their voice. Another might demand that someone's body weaken, their mind falter, their life unravel. And always, there is an invocation, a call to something beyond: gods, spirits, underworld forces, entities believed to have the power to act, to intervene, to carry out the will of the one who wrote the curse. This was not casual. It was not metaphorical. It was believed to be real. And that belief is what gives these objects their weight, because they represent a part of history that is often overlooked. Not the grand achievements, not the visible structures, but the private fears, the quiet desperation, the moments when people felt powerless and turned to something else. Something unseen. Cursed tablets have been found across the Roman world, in Britain, in Italy, in North Africa, buried in wells, thrown into rivers, placed in graves, locations believed to connect to the underworld, to places where messages could pass from the human world to something beyond it. And this consistency suggests something important. This was not an isolated practice. It was widespread, common, understood, but also hidden. Because unlike other aspects of Roman life, this was not openly discussed. There are no official texts explaining how to create a curse tablet, no public instructions, no formal acknowledgement, and yet they exist, in large numbers, which raises a question. If this practice was so common, why was it kept so quiet? The answer may lie in its nature. Because cursed tablets exist in a space between belief and taboo. They are not part of formal religion, not part of sanctioned rituals. They operate outside the system, in the shadows, where personal desire meets fear, where justice is not achieved through law, but through something else, something less visible, and perhaps less controlled, because many of the people who created these tablets were not powerful. They were ordinary, workers, merchants, slaves, people with limited influence, limited access to legal systems, limited ability to resolve conflict through conventional means, so they turned to something else, a way to act, to respond, to seek control in a world where they had very little. And that is what makes these tablets so revealing, because they show us a different side of history, not the official version, but the personal one, the emotional one, filled with frustration, with anger, with fear, and with a desire for something to change. But there is another layer to this mystery, because while we can read the words, we do not know what happened next. Did the curses work? Did the people targeted suffer? Did anything actually change? From a modern perspective, the answer is likely no. These were symbolic acts, expressions of emotion, but for those who created them, the belief was real. And belief can have power, not necessarily over the world, but over perception, over experience. If someone believed they had been cursed, that belief alone could affect them, their thoughts, their actions, their health, in ways that are difficult to measure. So even if the curse itself had no direct effect, the idea of it might have, which blurs the line between reality and belief, between cause and effect. And that is where this mystery becomes more complex, because it is not just about what the tablets are, but what they represent, a system of thought, a way of understanding the world, where unseen forces are active, where words carry weight, where intention matters, and where writing something down can change reality. But there is still something else, something more difficult to explain, because some of these tablets are incredibly detailed. Specific instructions, precise descriptions, names, dates, locations, almost as if the writer believed that the more detailed the request, the more likely it would be fulfilled. This level of detail suggests structure, a system, not random acts, but learned behavior, knowledge passed from one person to another. But again, no official record, no clear explanation, just the objects themselves and the patterns within them, which leads to a deeper question. Was there a group, a community, a hidden network of individuals who understood this practice more deeply? People who knew how to write these curses, how to structure them, how to invoke the right forces. It is possible, because some tablets show signs of professional writing, careful language, structured phrases, as if they were created by someone with experience. But without written documentation, we cannot confirm this, and so the mystery remains, because what we are left with is a collection of voices, written in lead, buried, hidden, preserved by chance. Voices that speak of conflict, of desire, of fear, and of belief in something beyond the visible world. And perhaps that is what makes them so powerful. Not just what they say, but what they reveal. Because they show us that beneath the structure of Roman society, there was something else, something informal, something personal, a belief system that operated in silence, in secret, in moments when no one else was watching. And that belief was strong enough to leave a mark, even if that mark was hidden, even if it was never meant to be found. And now, centuries later, we uncover these tablets, we read their words, we try to understand them, but we are separated from the world that created them, from the mindset, the beliefs, the context. So we interpret, we analyze, we question, but we do not fully know. And maybe we never will, because some parts of history are not meant to be fully understood. They are fragments, pieces of something larger, something that existed in a way we can no longer access. And the cursed tablets are one of those fragments, a glimpse into a hidden world. A world where words were weapons, where belief shaped reality, and where even the smallest object could carry the weight of someone's deepest fears. The civilization that built and disappeared. There are places in the world that feel incomplete, not because they are unfinished, but because something is missing. Structures stand, walls remain, paths still exist, but the people who built them are gone. Not gradually replaced, not clearly recorded, just gone, leaving behind questions that echo through time. On a remote island in the Pacific Ocean, thousands of miles from any major landmass, there is such a place. An island isolated by distance, surrounded by vast stretches of open water. A place that should feel empty, but doesn't, because scattered across its landscape are faces, massive stone faces, carved from rock, standing in silence, watching. These are the Muai of Easter Island, and they are among the most haunting reminders of a civilization that seems to have vanished. At first glance, the statues are striking, tall, imposing, some standing over 30 feet high, weighing tens of tons, carved with precision, with distinct features, elongated faces, deep-set eyes, expressions that feel both calm and distant. They are positioned across the island, facing inland, as if watching over something or someone. But today, there is no one there to watch, because the society that created them collapsed, and no one knows exactly how. The island itself is known as Rapa Nui, and the people who lived there were skilled, capable, organized. They developed a culture, a system, a way of life that allowed them to survive in isolation. And at some point, they began building, not small structures, not simple carvings, but monumental statues. Hundreds of them, each one requiring effort, coordination, planning, time. The process of creating a moai was complex. The stone had to be quarried, carved, transported across the island, and then raised into position, without modern tools, without advanced machinery. And yet, they did it again and again, which raises an important question. Why? Why invest so much energy into something so massive? Some believe the statues represented ancestors, important figures, leaders, spiritual guardians, placed across the island to protect the people, to watch over the land. Others suggest they were symbols of status, each group competing to build larger, more impressive statues, demonstrating power, influence. But whatever the reason, the effort was immense, and it continued for generations, until it stopped. The building ended, the statues remained, but the society changed. When European explorers first arrived on the island in the 18th century, they found something unexpected. Not a thriving civilization, but a fragmented one. The population was small, the environment was damaged, resources were limited, and many of the statues had been toppled, lying on the ground, broken, as if something had gone wrong. And that is where the mystery begins. Because something did go wrong. But what? One of the most widely accepted explanations is environmental collapse. That the people of Rapa Nui overused their resources, cut down trees, consumed the island's natural supplies to support the construction of the statues, and in doing so, destroyed the balance that allowed them to survive. Without trees, the soil eroded. Food became scarce. The system broke down, leading to conflict, population decline, and eventual collapse. This theory is supported by evidence. The island once had forests. Now it does not. There are signs of deforestation, of environmental strain. But even this explanation is not complete, because it assumes a level of mismanagement that is difficult to confirm. It suggests that the people unintentionally destroyed their own society. But is that the full story? Some researchers argue that the situation was more complex, that the collapse was not just environmental, but also social, that as resources became scarce, conflict increased, groups turned against each other, competition replaced cooperation, and the statues themselves became targets, symbols of power, pulled down, destroyed as part of internal struggles. But again, the evidence is partial, incomplete, because there is another factor, one that is often overlooked. Contact. When Europeans arrived, they did not just observe, they brought disease, new pressures, external influences, events that could have accelerated the decline. But this does not explain everything, because signs of collapse appear before sustained contact, which means something was already happening, something internal, something gradual, and that brings us back to the statues, because they are the clearest evidence of what once existed, and also of what changed. The moai were not just built, they were placed with intention, aligned, positioned, part of a system. But later, many were overturned. Deliberately, many were overturned. Deliberately, not by natural forces, but by people, which suggests a shift, a change in belief, in structure, in society. Something that caused the meaning of the statues to be rejected or abandoned. And that shift is difficult to trace, because we do not have written records, no detailed accounts from the people themselves, only oral traditions, stories passed down, and interpretations based on archaeology, which leaves room for uncertainty, for multiple explanations, for questions that cannot be fully answered. But there is another layer to this mystery, one that goes beyond collapse. Because the creation of the moai itself is still not fully understood, not in terms of how they were carved, but how they were moved. Some statues were transported miles from their quarry, across uneven terrain, without wheels, without large animals, and yet they reached their destinations. How? There are theories. Some suggest they were dragged, using ropes and manpower. Others propose they were walked, moved upright, rocked side to side, guided into place. Experiments have shown this is possible, but it requires coordination, skill, understanding, and that brings us back to the people, because whatever happened to them, they were capable, innovative, organized, and then something changed. Something disrupted that system, and the society that once built monumental statues came something else, smaller, fragmented, different. Which leaves us with a powerful image, an island, covered in statues, faces carved in stone, looking inward, watching over a land that no longer reflects what it once was. Because the people who created them are no longer there in the same way. Their culture changed, their structure shifted, their story interrupted. And perhaps that is what makes this mystery so compelling, not just the disappearance, but the contrast between what once existed and what remains. Because the moai are not just statues, they are evidence, proof of a society that achieved something remarkable and then lost it, or transformed, or faded, in ways we do not fully understand. And that uncertainty is what stays with us, because it reminds us of something important, that even in isolation, even in places far from the rest of the world, civilizations rise, create, build, and sometimes they fall. Not always with clear reasons, not always with complete records, but with enough evidence to show that something happened, something significant, something we are still trying to understand. And as the statues stand in silence, facing a land that has changed, they continue to ask a question, one that remains unanswered. What happened here? The map that should not exist. Maps are meant to guide us. They show us where we are, where we've been, where we can go. They are built on knowledge, on observation, on understanding the world as it exists. But what happens when a map shows something that should not have been known? Something that wasn't supposed to exist at the time it was drawn? In 1513, an Ottoman admiral named Piri Raz created a map. At first glance, it appears ordinary, a depiction of coastlines, regions of the known world, drawn with ink on parchment, carefully detailed, structured. But as historians began to study it more closely, something strange emerged. because this map shows parts of the world with a level of accuracy that seems out of place. Not just the familiar regions, but areas that, according to conventional history, were not fully explored at the time. The Piri Reis map includes sections of the western coast of Africa, parts of South America, and most intriguingly, a landmass that some believe resembles Antarctica. But here's the problem. Antarctica was not officially discovered until the 19th century, and even then, it was covered in ice, hidden, unmapped. So how could a map from the early 16th century depict something that wasn't known? At first, the explanation seems simple. Perhaps it's a coincidence, a distortion, an interpretation of known coastlines that just happens to resemble something else. But when examined more closely, the details become harder to dismiss. The shapes, the proportions, the alignment of certain features, they suggest knowledge, not guesswork, which raises a question that is difficult to answer. Where did this information come from? Piri Reis himself offered an explanation. He claimed that his map was based on earlier sources, older maps, some of which, he said, dated back to ancient times, maps that no longer exist, maps that were copied, combined, interpreted, and used to create his own. If this is true, then the mystery becomes even deeper, because it suggests that the knowledge did not originate with him, but with something older, something lost, something we no longer have access to. And that leads to a possibility that is both fascinating and unsettling. What if ancient civilizations had knowledge of the world that we do not fully understand? What if they mapped regions long before we believed they were discovered? This idea challenges the timeline we rely on, the sequence of exploration, the progression of discovery, because it suggests that history may not be as linear as we think, that knowledge may have existed earlier and then disappeared, leaving behind only fragments, like this map. But there are alternative explanations, more grounded, more cautious. Some historians argue that the map is not as accurate as it appears, that the supposed representation of Antarctica is actually a distorted version of South America, that the shapes have been misinterpreted, seen through a modern lens. And while this explanation is plausible, it does not resolve everything, because even beyond the Antarctic question, the map still shows a level of detail that is impressive for its time. Coastlines that align closely with modern measurements, proportions that suggest careful observation, not just approximation. Which brings us back to the sources. If Piri Reis used older maps, where did those maps come from? Who created them, and how did they obtain their information? Some believe that these maps may have originated from earlier civilizations, Greek, Phoenician, possibly even older, cultures known for navigation, for exploration, for understanding the sea. But even these civilizations had limitations: their technology, their reach, their ability to measure and record large distances accurately. So how did they achieve this level of detail? There are theories that suggest advanced methods, lost techniques, ways of observing and recording the world that have not survived. Others propose that knowledge was passed down from one generation to another, copied, preserved, but eventually lost through war, through time, through the destruction of libraries. Because history is not just about what is created, it is also about what is destroyed, what is forgotten, what does not survive. And if the original sources of the Piri Reis map were lost, then what we are seeing is not the beginning of knowledge, but the end of it. A final copy, a fragment, of something much older, something we can no longer fully trace. But there is another layer to this mystery. Because the map itself is incomplete, only a portion of it survives. The rest is missing, which means that whatever information it once contained may have been even more extensive, more detailed, more revealing, but we cannot know because we do not have it. And that absence adds to the uncertainty, because we are trying to understand something with only part of the evidence, which leaves room for interpretation, for speculation, for questions that cannot be fully answered. But perhaps the most intriguing aspect of this mystery is not just what the map shows, but what it represents. Because it suggests that knowledge is not always permanent. That information can exist, be recorded, and then disappear, leaving behind only fragments. Fragments that hint at something greater, but do not fully explain it. And that idea is difficult to ignore, because it means that our understanding of history is based on what has survived, not necessarily on what existed. And if something as detailed as this map is based on sources we no longer have, then what else has been lost? What other maps? What other records? What other knowledge once existed but is now gone? Because the Piri Reis map is not just an object, it is a question. A question about exploration, about knowledge, about the limits of what we think ancient people understood, and perhaps more importantly, about the gaps in our own understanding. Because when we look at this map, we are not just seeing coastlines. We are seeing a possibility that history may not be as simple as we believe. That discovery may not follow a straight path. That knowledge can appear and then vanish. And that what we have today may only be part of the story, because somewhere in the past, someone created the sources that made this map possible. Someone observed the world, recorded it, understood it, in a way that we are still trying to piece together. And then, that knowledge was lost, leaving behind only this, a map, a fragment, a mystery that continues to challenge what we think we know. The event that rewrote time. There are moments in history that change everything. Wars, discoveries, decisions that reshape the future. But those moments are usually clear, documented, understood. We know when they happened, why they happened, what followed. But what if there was an event so significant that it altered the course of history itself? And yet almost no one knows exactly what it was, not because it was hidden, not because it was erased, but because it happened so suddenly, so violently, that it left behind confusion instead of clarity. In the year 536 AD, something occurred that would go on to be described by historians as one of the worst periods to be alive. Not a war, not a single disaster, but something far more unusual, a change in the world itself. It began with the sky. Accounts from across different regions described the same thing. A strange dimming. The sun appeared weaker, faded, as if a veil had been drawn across it. Not for a day, not for a week, but for months, possibly longer. In parts of Europe, the sun gave off little light. Daytime felt like twilight. Temperatures dropped. Summer never truly arrived. Crops failed. Food became scarce, and this was not limited to one region. Records from the Byzantine Empire, from China, from the Middle East, all describe unusual atmospheric conditions, a haze, a fog, a darkness that lingered, which raises a question that still has no definitive answer: what caused it? At first, the explanations were limited. Ancient writers described it as a sign, an omen, a disturbance in the natural order, but they did not understand the cause. They could only describe what they saw, and what they saw was a world that had changed. But modern science has offered theories. One of the most widely accepted is volcanic activity, a massive eruption, or multiple eruptions, so powerful that they released enormous amounts of ash and particles into the atmosphere, blocking sunlight, altering the climate, lowering temperatures across the globe. There is evidence to support this. Ice core samples show spikes in volcanic material during this period, indicators of significant eruptions. But even this explanation is not complete, because the scale of the event seems unusually large. Some studies suggest that it was not just one eruption, but a series of them, occurring over several years, creating a prolonged period of cooling. And that prolonged effect would have had serious consequences, because when temperatures drop, agriculture suffers, food becomes scarce, and when food is scarce, societies destabilize, which is exactly what appears to have happened. The years following 536 AD were marked by hardship, famine, disease, population decline. In some regions, entire communities struggled to survive. And then, as if that were not enough, another crisis emerged, a pandemic, Known as the Justinian Plague, it spread rapidly, killing millions, further weakening societies already under strain. And this combination, climate disruption, food shortages, disease, created a period of instability unlike anything seen before, which leads to an unsettling possibility that the event of 536 AD did not just affect the environment, it changed the course of human history. Entire regions were impacted, economies weakened, structures disrupted, and in some cases, civilizations declined. But what makes this mystery so compelling is not just the impact, it is the uncertainty. Because despite all the evidence, we still do not know exactly what happened. Not with complete confidence. We have clues, data, patterns, but no single definitive explanation, which leaves room for other ideas. Some suggest that the event may have been caused by a comet or a meteor impact, something that released debris into the atmosphere, creating the same effect as volcanic ash. Others propose more complex climate interactions, natural cycles, combined with specific events, leading to a sudden shift. But again, these are theories, supported in part, but not fully confirmed, and that lack of certainty is what makes this event so unusual, because it is not just a mystery of cause, it is a mystery of consequence, because the effects of this period extended far beyond the immediate years. Some historians believe that this event contributed to long-term changes, shifts in power, declines in certain regions, the rise of others. That the instability created by this period opened the door for transformation, for new structures to emerge, for history to move in a different direction. And if that is true, then the event of 536 AD was not just a temporary disruption, it was a turning point, one that we do not fully understand. Because when we look at history, we often focus on visible events, battles, leaders, decisions, but sometimes the most significant changes come from something else, something environmental, something unexpected, something that affects everything at once, without warning, without clear explanation. And that is what makes this event so powerful. Because it reminds us that human history is not isolated. It is connected to the world around it, to the environment, to forces that we cannot control. And when those forces shift, everything else follows. But there is another layer to this mystery. Because while we can study the effects, we cannot fully experience them. We can read descriptions, analyze data, but we cannot feel what it was like. To live in a world where the sun no longer shines properly, where seasons fail, where food disappears, where uncertainty becomes constant, and that gap between knowledge and experience is where the mystery remains. Because it leaves us with questions, not just about what happened, but about how it felt, how people responded, how they adapted, or failed to, because survival in such conditions would not have been easy, and yet life continued, in some form, despite everything, which speaks to something deeper: resilience, adaptation, the ability to endure, even in the face of events we do not understand. And perhaps that is the most important part of this story, not just the mystery of what caused it, but the reality of what followed. Because the event of 536 AD is not just a historical anomaly, it is a reminder that the world can change, suddenly, unexpectedly, in ways that are difficult to predict. And when it does, everything else changes with it. Because history is not just shaped by human action, it is shaped by forces beyond it. Forces that leave behind traces, clues, evidence, but not always answers. And the year 536 AD is one of those moments, a time when the world dimmed, when the climate shifted, when society struggled, and when something happened that we are still trying to understand. A moment that reminds us that even the most important events do not always come with clear explanations. The treasure that was never found. There are discoveries that change history, and then there are discoveries that never happen, not because nothing is there, but because whatever is there has never been found. despite centuries of searching, despite clues, maps, stories passed down through generations, because sometimes the most valuable things in history are not what we uncover, but what we keep looking for. Across continents and cultures, there are legends of lost treasures, gold hidden in mountains, jewels buried beneath cities, artifacts concealed in places no one has reached. Most of these stories fade, dismissed as myth, exaggeration, imagination, but some refuse to disappear. They persist, growing stronger with time, drawing people in, inspiring expeditions, because they are built on something more than just rumor, something that feels real. One of the most enduring of these mysteries is the story of a lost city, a city said to be filled with unimaginable wealth, not just gold, but something more symbolic, more powerful, a place where an entire civilization expressed its identity through riches, a place known by a single name, El Dorado. The story begins in South America, among the early encounters between European explorers and indigenous cultures. When Spanish conquistadors arrived, they were searching for wealth, driven by stories of gold, of cities filled with treasure. And then they heard something, not about a city, but about a ritual, a ceremony performed by a leader, a ruler who covered himself in gold dust, who stood on a raft in the middle of a lake and made offerings. Gold, jewels, dropped into the water as part of a sacred act. This figure became known as El Dorado, the Golden One. But over time, the story changed. It evolved. What began as a ritual came a place, a city, a kingdom, hidden somewhere in the vast landscapes of South America, filled with gold beyond imagination. And that transformation is where the mystery begins. Because once the idea of a city took hold, the search began. Expeditions were launched. Explorers ventured deep into unfamiliar territory, through jungles, across rivers, into regions that were difficult to navigate, all driven by the same question, where is it? But the further they traveled, the less clear the answer became. Because no one could agree on its location. Some believed it was in the Andes, others pointed to the Amazon. Some claimed it was near specific lakes, others believed it had already been destroyed or abandoned, which meant that every expedition was based on incomplete information, fragments of stories, interpretations of interpretations. And yet, the search continued, because there were clues, artifacts, gold objects found in various regions, evidence that wealth did exist, that the stories were not entirely fictional, but the city itself remained out of reach. And that is where the mystery deepens, because over time, expeditions became more desperate, more dangerous. Some ended in failure, others in disaster. Explorers got lost, supplies ran out, entire groups disappeared, and still no city, no definitive discovery, only more stories, more speculation, more uncertainty, which raises an important question. Did El Dorado ever exist, or was it always a misunderstanding? Some historians believe that the original story was misinterpreted, that there was never a city, only a ritual, a cultural practice that was expanded into something larger, through imagination, through expectation, through the desire to find something extraordinary. And that as the story spread, it grew, changed, until it became something else entirely. But others argue that there may have been real locations, settlements, centers of wealth that were never fully explored, or that were lost over time, hidden by nature, covered by the environment, buried beneath layers of history. Because the regions where El Dorado is believed to exist are vast, dense, difficult to search. The Amazon rainforest alone covers millions of square kilometers, much of it unexplored, which means that even today, there are areas where entire structures could remain hidden, undiscovered. And that possibility keeps the mystery alive, because it suggests that the story may not be entirely fictional, that something could still be out there, waiting. But there is another layer to this, one that goes beyond geography, because the idea of El Dorado is not just about a place. It is about a concept, the idea of hidden wealth, of something valuable, just beyond reach, something that can be found if you search hard enough. And that idea is powerful. It drives exploration. It fuels imagination. It creates stories that persist across generations, because people want to believe that something extraordinary is still out there, and perhaps that belief is what gives the story its strength. Not the evidence, not the proof, but the possibility. Because even after centuries of searching, even after countless expeditions, the question remains, where is it? Or more precisely, was it ever there? Because the line between myth and reality is not always clear, especially when stories evolve, when details change, when interpretations shift. And El Dorado exists in that space, between what was and what is imagined. But there is one final possibility, one that is rarely considered. What if the treasure was never meant to be found? What if it was not hidden, but lost? Lost through time, through change, through the natural process of history. Because civilizations rise and fall, structures are built and abandoned, locations shift, environments change, and what once existed can disappear, not intentionally, but gradually, until there is nothing left to find, only stories. And if that is the case, then the search for El Dorado is not a search for a place, it is a search for something that no longer exists, something that was real, but is now gone, which makes it both a mystery and a reminder that not everything in history can be recovered, not everything can be rediscovered. Some things are lost, completely, leaving behind only traces, hints, fragments of stories that suggest something more, but do not confirm it. And perhaps that is why the story of El Dorado endures, because it is not just about gold, it is about the unknown, about the possibility that something extraordinary exists, just beyond our understanding, just out of reach, and that even after centuries of searching, we are still asking the same question. What if it's still there? The signal we still don't understand. There are moments when the universe speaks, not in words, not in ways we expect, but in signals, patterns, events that don't fit into what we understand. And when those moments happen, they leave behind something unusual, not answers, but questions. In 1977, in a quiet control room at a radio observatory, a scientist was reviewing data, not looking for anything extraordinary, just scanning through recordings, signals from space, background noise, routine information, the kind of work that rarely leads to anything unexpected. But then, something appeared, a signal. Unlike anything they had seen before, it was strong, precise, and most importantly, it was not random. It stood out clearly against the background noise, a narrow-band radio signal lasting for 72 seconds, and then it was gone, never repeated, never explained. The scientist reviewing the data circled it, wrote a single word next to it, one word that would define this mystery for decades. Wow. And so it became known as the wow signal. At first, the reaction was curiosity. Signals from space are not unusual, but this one was different because of its intensity, its structure, its clarity. It did not behave like typical cosmic noise. It did not match known natural sources, and it did not repeat, which made it impossible to confirm, impossible to study further. And that is where the mystery begins, because when something appears once and never again, it becomes difficult to understand, difficult to test, difficult to explain. And the wow signal exists in that space, between detection and uncertainty. The signal was detected by the Big Ear radio telescope in Ohio, a machine designed to listen, to scan the sky, to capture radio waves from distant sources. It recorded data continuously, converting signals into numbers, which scientists would later analyze. And within that data, this signal stood out, its strength increased, peaked, then faded. exactly as expected if the source was moving across the sky, which suggests something important. The signal came from a specific location, a fixed point in space, not from Earth, not from a nearby source, but from somewhere far beyond. And that is where the questions begin. Because if the signal came from space, what produced it? One possibility is natural origin, that it was caused by a cosmic event, a star, a pulsar, a cloud of gas, something emitting radio waves, but the characteristics of the signal do not match typical natural sources. It was too narrow, too focused, too precise. Natural signals tend to be broader, more chaotic, less structured. This one was different, which leads to another possibility: artificial origin, a signal created by technology, by something designed to transmit. And that idea is both fascinating and unsettling, because if the signal was artificial, then it raises a question we have been asking for a long time: are we alone? But before jumping to that conclusion, there are other explanations. Perhaps the signal came from Earth, a reflection, an interference, a human-made transmission that was misinterpreted, but extensive analysis found no clear source, no known signal that matches, no evidence of interference at that level. And the fact that it never repeated makes it even more difficult to explain. Because if it were a recurring source, we would expect to detect it again, to study it, to confirm its origin. But we have not. Decades have passed. Technology has improved. Observatories have scanned the same region, and yet nothing, which creates a unique kind of mystery because it is not ongoing. It is not evolving. It is static. A single event, frozen in time, leaving behind only data and questions. Some researchers have suggested that the signal could have been a rare natural event, something that occurs infrequently, a unique alignment, a temporary phenomenon. But without repetition, this remains speculation. Others have proposed more unusual ideas, that the signal could have been a form of communication, a transmission sent intentionally, but not directed at us, just passing through, detected by chance, in that moment, at that location, and then gone. If that were the case, then we were not the intended audience, just observers, witnesses to something not meant for us. And that possibility is difficult to confirm, but also difficult to dismiss, because the universe is vast, beyond comprehension, filled with possibilities, events happening constantly, most of which we will never detect, never understand. And the wow signal may be one of those events, a brief glimpse, a moment where something aligned just enough for us to notice, and then disappeared. But there is another layer to this mystery, one that goes beyond the signal itself, because what makes the wow signal so compelling is not just what it is, but what it represents. Because it sits at the edge of knowledge, at the boundary between what we understand and what we don't. It challenges assumptions, it invites speculation, it forces us to consider possibilities that we cannot confirm. And that tension is what gives it power. Because we are not just looking at data, we are looking at a question that extends far beyond a single signal, a question about existence, about connection, about whether something else is out there, and whether we will ever know, because the search continues. New telescopes, new telescopes, new telescopes, all focused on the same goal: listening, watching, waiting for another signal, another moment, another clue. But so far, nothing has matched the wow signal. Nothing has repeated its pattern, its intensity, its structure, and that uniqueness is what keeps it unresolved. Because without repetition, there is no confirmation. Without confirmation, there is no conclusion. Only possibility. And possibility is where mystery lives. Because the wow signal does not give us answers. It gives us a moment, a brief event, captured, recorded, and then left behind. Like a message that we cannot read. because we do not know the language, or even if it is a message at all. And maybe that is the most important part, not what the signal was, but what it means to us, because it reminds us that we are still searching, still listening, still trying to understand a universe that is far larger than we can comprehend. And sometimes that universe responds, not with clarity, not with explanation, but with something else, something brief, something unexplained, something that makes us stop and ask a simple question: what was that? And even after all this time, we still don't know. The world is filled with mysteries. Some are hidden, some are lost, and some are right in front of us, waiting, not to be solved, but to be understood, or perhaps to remind us that not everything can be. Because history is not complete, knowledge is not absolute, and the unknown is always closer than we think. The structure that defies explanation. There are buildings that impress us because of their size, their beauty, their design, and then there are structures that don't just impress, they confuse, not because they are broken, but because they are too precise, too perfect, too difficult to explain. Even with everything we know today, in the mountains of Peru, high above sea level, there is a place where stone has been shaped in a way that seems almost impossible. A place where massive blocks of rock fit together so tightly that you cannot slide a blade between them. No gaps, no mortar, no visible binding, just stone, perfectly aligned with stone. This is Sacsayhuaman, and it is one of the most puzzling constructions ever created. At first glance, it looks like a fortress. Large walls, terraced levels, strategic positioning overlooking the city of Cusco. But as you move closer, something changes. Because the stones are not uniform, they are not cut into simple shapes, they are irregular, massive, each one uniquely formed, and yet they fit together perfectly, like a puzzle. Except this puzzle is made of stones that weigh up to 100 tons. Think about that. Hundreds of tons of stone, moved, shaped, placed, with such precision that even modern tools struggle to replicate it. And this was done without metal tools as we know them, without advanced machinery, without modern engineering techniques. So how? That is the question that defines this structure, because traditional explanations only go so far. One theory suggests that the builders used basic tools, stone hammers, manual shaping, careful grinding, over long periods of time, slowly refining each block until it fit perfectly with the others. It is possible, but it requires something extraordinary: time, patience, and an almost unimaginable level of skill. Because these are not small adjustments. These are massive stones, being shaped with precision on multiple sides, to align perfectly with surrounding blocks. And that level of accuracy is difficult to achieve even today, especially without advanced measurement tools. Which raises another question: how did they know when the fit was perfect? Without modern instruments, without precise measurement systems, how did they achieve such consistency? Some researchers believe they used trial and error, placing the stone, adjusting it, removing it, shaping it again, repeating the process until it fit. But imagine the effort. Moving a 100-ton stone multiple times just to refine its shape, it seems almost impractical. And yet, the result is undeniable. The stones fit perfectly, and not just one or two, entire walls stretching across large distances, which suggests something more than just effort, something systematic, something understood. Another theory focuses on the possibility of lost techniques, methods of shaping stone that we no longer have, knowledge that existed at the time but did not survive. Because history is not just about what is passed down, it is also about what is lost. And if these builders had techniques we do not understand, then what we are seeing is not a mystery of capability, but a mystery of knowledge. But there is more. Because it is not just the fit of the stones that is unusual, it is their shape. Many of the blocks have multiple angles, 5 sides, 6 sides, sometimes more. each one unique, and yet they interlock, stabilizing the structure, making it resistant to movement. Which leads to another remarkable detail: earthquakes. This region is seismically active. Earthquakes are common, and yet these walls have survived for centuries. While many later structures collapsed, the stones shift slightly during movement, then settle back into place because of their shape, because of their fit, which suggests something even more impressive. The builders were not just creating walls, they were engineering stability, designing structures that could adapt to the environment. Without modern understanding of seismic activity, without formal engineering theory, and yet they achieved it. Which brings us back to the central question: how? Some have suggested that the stones were softened, that the builders used some methods to alter the surface of the rock, making it easier to shape, almost like molding. This idea is controversial because there is no clear evidence of such a technique, but it persists because the precision of the fit feels beyond conventional explanation. Others propose that the construction involved a level of planning we underestimate, that the builders had systems, techniques, processes that allowed them to manage complexity, to coordinate effort, to achieve results that seem impossible from the outside. And perhaps that is the most likely explanation, not that the builders had unknown powers, but that they had knowledge we no longer fully understand. But even this leaves questions, because structures like Sacsayhuaman are not isolated. There are other sites, other examples of stonework with similar precision, across different regions, different cultures, which suggests something broader, a pattern, a level of capability that appears in multiple places, but is not fully explained. And that pattern is difficult to ignore, because it challenges assumptions about what ancient civilizations could do, about what tools they had, about what knowledge they possessed. It suggests that the past may be more advanced in certain ways than we often assume, not in technology as we define it, but in skill, in understanding, in the ability to work with materials in ways that are difficult to replicate. And that idea is both fascinating and humbling, because it reminds us that progress is not always linear, that knowledge can exist and then disappear, that capabilities can be achieved and then lost, leaving behind only results, structures, evidence, but not the methods. And that is what we see here, not just stones, but questions about process, about knowledge, about what we may be missing. Because when we look at Sacsayhuaman, we are not just looking at a structure, we are looking at a challenge to our understanding, to our assumptions, to what we think is possible. And perhaps that is what makes it so powerful. Not just what it is, but what it represents. Because it stands as proof that something happened here, something precise, something intentional, something we're still trying to understand. And maybe that is enough. Because not every mystery needs to be solved. Some exist to remind us that there is still more to learn, more to uncover, more to question. And as long as structures like this remain silent, unmoving, perfectly aligned, they will continue to do exactly that. The city beneath the ocean. There are places in the world that were never meant to be found, not because they were hidden, but because they were lost. Covered. Submerged. Taken by something beyond human control. And when those places are discovered again, they don't just raise questions, they rewrite what we thought we knew. Because sometimes the past doesn't disappear, it sinks. Off the coast of Japan, near an island called Yonaguni, divers searching the ocean floor came across something unexpected. At first, it looked natural. A series of rock formations, sharp edges, flat surfaces, layered structures, flat surfaces, layered structures. But the longer they looked, the stranger it became. Because these formations did not behave like natural rock. They looked designed. Massive stone steps descending into the deep. Terraces, platforms, Straight lines, angles that felt intentional, as if something had been built there, not formed, built. This discovery would later be known as the Yonaguni Monument, and from the moment it was first explored, it became one of the most debated underwater structures in the world. Because if it is natural, then it is one of the most unusual natural formations ever seen. But if it is artificial, then it changes everything. Because it would mean that a structure of this scale was built thousands of years ago, before the ocean covered it, which raises a question that is difficult to ignore. Who built it? And when? To understand the significance of this, we need to consider sea levels. At the end of the last ice age, around 10,000 years ago, sea levels were much lower than they are today. Large areas of land that are now underwater were once exposed, walkable, habitable, which means that if the Yonaguni structure was built before sea levels rose, it could be incredibly old, far older than most known large-scale constructions, older than many civilizations we recognize. And that possibility is what makes this discovery so controversial, because it challenges the timeline, the sequence of development, the idea that complex structures only appeared after certain points in history. But the structure itself is difficult to ignore. The steps are large, uniform, the edges are sharp, the surface is flat. There are features that resemble pathways, even what some believe are carvings, patterns that suggest intention. But not everyone agrees. Many geologists argue that the formation is natural, that the rock in this region tends to fracture along straight lines, creating shapes that can appear artificial, especially underwater, where erosion behaves differently, where perspective can be misleading. And this explanation has merit, because nature can create surprising patterns, symmetry, structures that resemble design. But even with that understanding, the Yonaguni Monument remains unusual, because the scale, the alignment, the layering all suggest something more, something that does not fit easily into a natural explanation, which leaves us in a familiar place between two possibilities, natural or artificial, and no definitive answer. But if we consider the possibility that it is artificial, then the implications are significant, because it would suggest that a complex structure existed in this region before it was submerged, which means there may have been a civilization, a culture capable of building at this scale, in a time period we do not fully associate with such development. And if that is true, then what else might be hidden? What other structures lie beneath the ocean? Because the ocean covers more than 70% of the Earth's surface, and much of it is unexplored, unmapped, unknown. There are vast areas where visibility is limited, where access is difficult, where discoveries are rare, which means that what we know is only a fraction of what exists. And the Yonaguni Monument may be one of those rare glimpses, a moment where something hidden becomes visible, but only partially, because even now, the full extent of the structure is not completely understood. There may be more layers, more features, more evidence, but reaching them is not easy. The ocean is unpredictable. Conditions change. Depth creates pressure, limitations, challenges that make exploration difficult, and that adds another layer to the mystery. Because even if there are answers, they may not be easy to find, which means the debate continues. Some see a natural formation, a coincidence of geology. Others see a lost structure, a remnant of something ancient. And between these views, the truth remains uncertain. But there is another possibility, one that is often overlooked. What if it is both? What if natural formations were shaped, modified, used by humans? A combination, nature providing the base, humans refining it, adapting it, turning it into something functional. If that were the case, then the structure is not purely natural and not entirely artificial, but something in between, a collaboration between environment and intention. And that idea adds complexity, because it suggests a level of interaction with the landscape, an understanding of how to use what already exists to create something new. But again, without clear evidence, this remains a possibility, not a conclusion. And so the mystery remains. Because what we are looking at is not just a structure. It is a question about time, about history, about what may have existed before recorded civilization. Because if structures like this are real, then our timeline may be incomplete. There may have been cultures, communities, capabilities that we do not fully recognize because they were lost, submerged, hidden beneath water. And that idea is both fascinating and unsettling, because it suggests that history is not fixed, not fully known, but layered, with parts that are visible and parts that are not. And the ocean holds many of those hidden layers, because unlike land, it does not preserve in the same way. It covers, it conceals, it transforms. And once something is beneath it, it becomes part of a different world, one that is harder to access, harder to study, harder to understand, which means that many stories may still be there, waiting, unseen, and the Yonaguni Monument may be one of those stories. A fragment, a piece of something larger, something we have only just begun to notice, but not yet understand. And perhaps that is what makes it so compelling, because it reminds us that the past is not always where we expect it to be. Sometimes it is beneath us, hidden, silent, waiting for the moment when it is seen again. There is something about the unknown that stays with us, long after the story ends, long after the facts are presented, long after the voices fall silent. Because some questions do not ask to be answered, they ask to be answered. They ask to be remembered. Throughout everything we have explored, every mystery, every lost object, every forgotten event, a pattern begins to emerge. Not a clear one, not something easy to define, but something consistent, something quiet, something just beneath the surface. A reminder that history is not complete, that what we know is only part of what exists. Because for every discovery we make, there are others we have not. For every answer we find, there are questions that remain. And perhaps that is the most important realization of all, that the world is not fully understood, not mapped, not finished. Because even in places we believe we know, there are gaps, moments where the story fades, where records end, where certainty disappears. And in those gaps, something remains. Not clarity, not explanation, but possibility. The lost legion, the ancient machine, the unexplained objects, the missing texts, the fading empires, the signals from beyond, each one different, each one separate, and yet connected by something deeper, absence, not just what is there, but what is not. What is missing, what cannot be fully explained. Because mystery does not come from what we see, it comes from what we cannot, from the spaces between facts, from the silence between records, from the moments where something should be there but isn't. And that absence is not empty, it is full of questions, full of possibilities, full of things we may never understand, but still feel. Because even without answers, these mysteries leave an impression. They stay with us. They change the way we see the world, not as something fixed, but as something still unfolding, still revealing itself, piece by piece. And that perspective changes everything, because it means that discovery is not over, that exploration is not finished, that the past is not fully uncovered, and that the future may not be as predictable as we think. Because if history has shown us anything, it is this: that certainty is temporary, that knowledge evolves, that what we believe today may change tomorrow, and that somewhere, right now, there are answers we have not yet found, not because they do not exist, but because we have not reached them. And maybe we never will, because not every mystery is meant to be solved. Some exist for a different reason: to challenge us, to remind us, to keep us searching, because the search itself is part of what defines us, the need to understand, to explore, to question, to look beyond what is known and imagine what is not. That curiosity is what drives everything. It is what led to every discovery, every advancement, every step forward, and it is also what keeps these mysteries alive, because as long as we are curious, as long as we continue to ask questions, these stories will not disappear. They will remain, not as answers, but as invitations. Invitations to think, to wonder, to consider possibilities, even if those possibilities never become certainty. Because sometimes, the value of a mystery is not in solving it, but in experiencing it, in allowing it to expand our understanding, in accepting that not everything needs to be defined, that some things can simply exist as questions. And perhaps that is the final truth, not that the world is unknowable, but that it is larger than our understanding, more complex than our explanations, more layered than our records, and that within those layers, there will always be something hidden, something just beyond reach, something waiting, not necessarily to be found, but to be noticed. Because the unknown is not separate from us. It is part of the world we live in, part of the history we study, part of the reality we experience. And as long as that unknown exists, there will always be something more. Another question, another mystery, another moment where we stop and realize we do not have all the answers, and maybe we are not supposed to, because in the end, it is not the answers that define us. It is the questions, the ones we ask, the ones we follow, the ones that stay with us, even when everything else fades. And as this journey comes to an end, those questions remain unresolved, unfinished, waiting, not for answers, but for the next moment of curiosity, the next discovery, the next discovery, the next step into the unknown. Because the story is never truly over, it only pauses, and somewhere, right now, another mystery is waiting. There is something about the unknown that lingers, not loudly, not in a way that demands attention, but quietly, almost patiently, like a thought that refuses to leave, a question that stays just beneath the surface, long after everything else has faded. Because no matter how much we explore, no matter how far we go, there is always something left behind, something incomplete, something unresolved. And maybe that's not a flaw in our understanding, maybe that's the point. Because throughout everything we've seen, every lost civilization, every unexplained artifact, every event that refuses to fit into the timeline we expect, there is a pattern, not a clear one, not something easy to define, but something consistent, a subtle reminder that what we call history is not the full story. It is only what remains, what survived, what was recorded, or what was allowed to be remembered. Because history is not just built on discovery, it is built on survival, on the fragile process of things making it through time. And that means something important. It means that for every piece of knowledge we have, there are others we don't. For every truth we believe, there may be another we've never encountered. And for every mystery we try to solve, there are layers beneath it we may never reach. Because time does not preserve everything equally, it erases, it distorts, it reshapes. Entire civilizations rise, create, build things that feel permanent and then disappear, leaving behind fragments, clues, pieces that hint at something greater but never fully explain it. And we look at those fragments, we study them, we try to reconstruct the past, to make sense of what happened, to create a narrative that feels complete. But there are always gaps, moments where the story fades, where the evidence ends, where certainty becomes speculation. And in those moments, we are left with something unusual, not answers, but possibilities. And possibility is where the unknown lives. Because the unknown is not just the absence of knowledge. It is the presence of something we haven't understood yet, something that exists, but does not fit into what we expect. And that discomfort, that tension between what we know and what we don't, is what makes these mysteries so powerful. because they challenge us, not just to learn more, but to think differently, to question assumptions, to accept that what we believe may not be complete, because certainty is comforting. It gives structure, clarity, a sense that the world makes sense. But the truth is, the world has never been fully certain. It has always been layered, complex, full of contradictions, full of things that don't align neatly. And history is no different. Because when we look back, we are not seeing the past as it was, we're seeing what remains of it, filtered through time, through loss, through interpretation. And that means something important. It means that what we call understanding is always evolving, always changing, always incomplete. And maybe that's what keeps us moving forward. Because if everything were known, if every question had an answer, there would be nothing left to explore, nothing left to discover, nothing left to wonder about. And without that, something essential would be missing. Because curiosity is not just about finding answers. It is about the search itself, the process, the moment of realization that there is something more, something beyond what we see. And that realization changes the way we experience the world. Because once you understand that not everything is known, you begin to notice things differently. You start to see the gaps, the inconsistencies, the places where something feels incomplete. And instead of ignoring them, you pay attention. Because those are the places where discovery begins, not in certainty, but in uncertainty, not in uncertainty, not in answers, but in questions. And the questions we've explored, the lost legion, the unexplained artifacts, the hidden knowledge, the signals from beyond, they are not isolated. They are part of something larger, a pattern of absence, a pattern of things that exist but are not fully understood. And that pattern suggests something important, that the unknown is not rare, it is everywhere. It exists in every field, every moment, every layer of reality. And we are constantly moving through it, learning, discovering, trying to make sense of it, but never fully reaching the end. Because there is no end. There is only continuation. Because every answer leads to another question. Every discovery opens another path. Every explanation reveals something else that still doesn't fit, and that is not failure. That is progress. Because progress is not about completing knowledge. It is about expanding it, pushing it further, recognizing that there is always more beyond it. And that recognition is what keeps everything moving. Because without it, we would stop. We would assume we've reached the end, that everything has been explained, that there is nothing left to find. But that has never been true, and it never will be, because the world is too vast, too complex, too layered to be fully understood. And maybe that is what makes it meaningful. Because meaning does not come from having all the answers. It comes from the experience of searching, from the moments of discovery, from the realization that there is always something more, something beyond what we currently understand. And that something is what drives everything. It is what led to exploration, to science, to history, to every attempt we've ever made to understand our place in the world. And it is still there, still present, still waiting, not as a problem to be solved, but as a possibility to be explored. Because the unknown is not an obstacle, it is an invitation to look deeper, to question more, to remain open to the idea that what we know is only part of the picture, and that picture is still being formed, still being shaped, still incomplete, and maybe it always will be. Because as long as we exist, as long as we continue to think, to question, to explore, there will always be something just beyond our understanding, something we haven't reached yet, something we haven't seen, something that will make us pause and ask, what is that? And in that moment, the cycle begins again. The search, the curiosity, the desire to understand. And that is what connects all of this. Not the mysteries themselves, but our response to them. Because we are drawn to the unknown, not because it is easy, but because it is not. Because it challenges us. Because it pushes us beyond what is comfortable. beyond what is certain, and into something else, something uncertain, something open, something alive. And maybe that is where the real story is, not in the answers we find, but in the questions that remain. Because those questions do not end, they continue, they evolve, they move forward with us. And as long as they exist, so does the search. And as long as the search continues, so does the story. Because the story is not behind us, it is not finished, it is not complete, it is happening, right now, in every moment, in every question, in every place where something doesn't quite make sense. And maybe that is the most important thing to remember, that we are not at the end of understanding, we are in the middle of it, still learning, still discovering, still trying to piece together a reality that is far more complex than we can fully grasp. And somewhere, right now, there is something waiting, something that will challenge everything we think we know, something that will shift our understanding, something that will remind us once again that the unknown is still there, and it always will be. And maybe that's where this story really begins. Because the more you look, the more you realize. These mysteries aren't just out there in the world, they're everywhere, hidden in history, buried in silence, waiting to be noticed. So if even one of these questions stayed with you, if even one moment made you pause, then don't stop here, because there is always more to uncover, more stories, more mysteries, more things that don't quite make sense yet. So take a moment, subscribe, stay connected, and keep exploring, because the next mystery might be closer than you think.